Okay, guys, I think we're going to kick off now. I think we have got a lot of participants in now. So yeah, so welcome everybody to Planning Our Energy Future. So this is Ireland's first dedicated energy planning conference. And it's we wanted to make sure that this was a free, non-sponsored, not-for-profit event, so that we could have, I suppose, the speakers that we wanted with their kind of experience to present on the day. Thanks to the SEAI, who have supported our work in this particular area in master planning work over the last few years through their RD&D program. We hope that this conference will really help to increase the knowledge and awareness of energy planning and its many benefits and applications. So obviously, this is quite a new area for Ireland, but we have a great lineup of speakers who will be covering the national to local level experience in Ireland. And then also we have some great speakers highlighting their experience for best practice in Europe. So we're very happy to have them on board. Just to let all attendees know that this event is being recorded, and we would ask you that you would use the Q&A box to post any questions or comments in there, and we have an upvoting function enabled. So if there, we have had over 300 registrations, so we will try and get to as many questions as we can, but we appreciate if you would upvote the ones you would like to hear answered first. That would be great. And that would help us to kind of prioritize which ones to answer. The recording and the slides will be circulated after the event. Yeah, I think that's all of the housekeeping notes. So I think we can kick off now straight into our agenda. So first up, we're delighted to be joined by Declan Mealy, who's going to present on kind of joining the dots between the national and local level in energy planning in Ireland. So Declan was recently appointed to the position of Director of Business and Public Sector and Transport with the SEAI. He's been with them since 2005 and has been involved in the successful delivery of many of the organisation's programmes. He's had experience in the industry, marine and ocean energy, smart grid, transport, communities, and most recently the national retrofit programmes. So we're very happy to have Declan's experience, and he's been a great supporter of energy planning in Ireland. So Declan, I'll pass the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Donna, and delighted to have the opportunity this morning. So really good conference, very important, obviously, in terms of getting everybody on board in terms of the thinking, and just delighted, that it's all big morning this morning in terms of the chance to talk to everybody. So hopefully you're seeing my screen there in terms of what is coming through. So what, as you said, I want to talk about is really, joining the dots between local and national and regional energy planning. And it's really just pointing out some of the commonalities that's there and a lot of the work that's going on, a lot of great work that's going on. And I'm looking at it kind of in terms of the presentation this morning in three areas. So I'll set out what I consider the kind of current energy policy context and how energy planning sits within that. Those of you who know me in terms of all my years within SAI couldn't have a presentation without talking about the structured approach, but I think that is at the heart of our planning as well in terms of moving on that, and then showing how the dots join between the different local, regional and national levels in terms of the thinking that this structured approach can bring and how it's working in communities and in counties and in terms of the local area plannings and the work that's ongoing. So in terms of setting out the policy context, I used this slide, and there was a version I used many years ago in terms of what's sustainability when we started to talk about it, and sustainable energy, on the basis that, well, take out energy and we'll kind of make the problem a little bit smaller. We get our heads around the energy piece, then the other things will follow. And I suppose, like for a local authority and anybody involved in planning, there are so many dimensions in planning that need to be considered. And we talked about three pillars before: society, environment, economy, the overlapping of those. and all of the, and then where we used to say, well, energy kind of underpins a lot of that on the infrastructure. So we take out energy and kind of look at the smaller piece and then say, well, okay, move on that. However, as people know from the media and over the last number of weeks, and certainly we've seen it, those of us involved directly over the last number of years, it's not a small problem. And the phrase I was seeing at a presentation recently, General Eisenhower, he said, whenever I run into a problem that I can't solve, I always make it bigger, because I can never solve something trying to make it smaller, but if I make it big enough, I can begin to see the outlines of a solution. And in terms of our planning and where it needs to go and the problems that are on us now as a society, boy, is it big. And climate change, is really the lens at which everything has to be looked at. And in terms of trumps everything, impacts everything, and is going to really look at how are we going to actually survive in the future in terms of our the way we work, the way we live, the way we move, and really look at, how are we going to plan for the next generation to be able to survive in the climate that has been created. So it makes it bigger, but actually I think it starts to bring a little bit of clarity, because everybody looking through the same lens means that you're focused on the same problem. Rather than looking at 50 different lenses, if we're looking at it through one and through the lens of climate change, it actually starts to bring a little bit of clarity. Now, again, in terms of the COP over the last week, phrases that have been coming out and people talk about it and pledges and all of that, the new thinking is around net zero. And what does net zero mean? Well, from an Ireland point of view, and particularly in the energy, I think it really means three things for us. And it's not to oversimplify it, but in terms of bringing the clarity, we have to generate as much of our energy, if not all of it, from renewables. We have to electrify heat and transport. So in terms of our homes, getting off fossil fuels, and our transport, in terms of how we move around in terms of the heat. And in terms of towns and cities, there's opportunities in terms of district heating and system networks. So in tackling those three things and working our way towards then the net zero, we can plan for that. And we can say, okay, what we do, does that actually work through the lens of the direction of travel in terms of getting to net zero? And the thing that people must realize is technology is not the issue. The technology that we need to get to net zero is here now. It is employed now, it is used now. Renewable, wind, electricity from wind, from solar, going offshore, onshore, general technologies that we need in terms of creating it. The electrification of our heat and transport, heat pumps and electric cars are evolving. The technology is there. It has become cheaper to use than the fossil fuel equivalents, but people have to look at how that's working on. So technology is not the issue. It is about getting it, however, everywhere. And the phrase that was used before, the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. So we have the technologies, and that was a phrase used by a guy I heard who decided many, many years ago, who saw that broadband going into homes that was being developed 20 years ago was going to allow videos and on-demand TV to be able to stream into a home. And 20 years ago, he decided to invest in Netflix and became a very wealthy person because he said, this is going to be everywhere. I saw it in a lab, but it's going to be everywhere. So the battery technologies that we need, the cars that we need, the heating systems that we need, the renewables that we need are here. We just need to plan for them and get them distributed everywhere. So then in terms of looking at this through the policy lens, the policy drivers are aligned. So the citizen has been put in the energy policy at the heart of the transition. Very important, and that just transition to make sure that they have a say and that they are involved. We have communities involved, and we're looking at and have been part of the policy in terms of growing our sustainable energy communities under the Climate Action Plan to over 1,500. We have 600 of them at the moment. So our homes and our communities are part of the plans, and in terms of how we can get there, and our retrofit targets, and looking at our electric vehicles. The regional plans are coming on stream, and in terms of the need to have those from an energy point of view. We have a national climate action plan, national targets aligned to EU, and aligned in terms of where we need to go. And the planning areas aligned to that as well. And it takes it right through from home, zone, city, town, national and international in terms of how we work across borders in terms of planning for energy, because energy will have to flow across borders as well as just been, and that's borders of parishes, borders of counties, borders of provinces, and cross borders in terms of countries, that we have to plan for those energies to be able to flow across each other's, and not been precious that it's just for us in the parish and doesn't matter about the others down. We have to work collectively together in our planning and our thinking. But in an energy consideration, there's two things that we have to try and get into our heads as well. Prior to this, energy was generated usually by ESB or some of the big players in a central place and distributed across the country to the homes through the wires. There's going to be a lot more interaction between demand and supply, and flows across those, again, between our counties, between our towns, and how that works. And the other thing that we have to plan for as well is in terms of just being passive homes of, passive takers of energy. We will be active generators at home level, at community level, at county level, and at national level. And being able to allow those flows are where we're going to have to get smart. And in terms of the smart planning that we have to look at, are we going to enable those flows of energy across the systems? And it is about flows when you come to planning. And for energy, we have to look at three flows: the flow of heat, the flow of electricity, and the flows of transport. And are we making them as efficient as possible? And again, by doing that, we look at it from water and waste, and again, the energy aspects of those. If we get the systems right and take a good approach in terms of the system flows in our planning systems, then we can actually look at getting it right and efficient and taking out the inefficiencies in it. The thinking again in industry and all that, and the thinking in terms of the role that energy efficiency has to play in this is, for example, instead of designing right angle bends and pipes that are thin and narrow, putting in wider pipes that allow smaller pumps, less, and using gravity to flow, back to the old way of thinking in terms of looking at how things flow around the place and making sure that it is efficient. But from an energy point of view, in terms of our planning, if we look at those three flows of heat, electricity, and transport, and make sure that we facilitate them in our planning, then it becomes efficient, and then it becomes possible in terms of interacting. And what happens and how we make it smart system flows is through good data and communication. In terms of communication between the systems, because it's across those that if information will need. It's not just taking them in sectors themselves, but actually using electricity to generate heat, to move the transport, using the transport in terms of actually ways, in terms of the moving of people. And obviously how we do that and the interactions going from bicycles right through to planes and whatever forms of transport are there in the future. So that's the context that I set out, and the thinking that we need to bring to our planning in getting smart and using data and communications to do it. But we don't have to have the finest granular data. We have to have good data and be able to use it widely, and again, communicate across the systems. So the next stage then is into the structured approach and how we've been teaching this over the many years of the programs, and for as long as I've been within SEI, since 2005. We developed energy management best practice as the Irish Energy Management Standard. It is now the worldwide best practice energy management standard. And the process that we developed was 5 steps, and you needed to get a commitment, you needed to identify, get your baseline, have your energy master plan, a list of projects that you want to do some of them, see how you get on, and go back and follow those steps again in terms of moving it through. The other side of the best practice of energy management, however, needs 3 legs in a stool to be balanced. So you need organizational commitment. And whether that is at a home, people will always have heard me say, whether it's at a home or at a country level, it doesn't matter. Whoever is in charge needs to give the commitment that they want to do this. You need to have somebody technical or some organization or support in terms of technical to understand where and how the energy is used and how those flows work. But the third, and generally the one that is forgotten about and probably the most important, is the people and developing that energy efficient culture. Now, if those 3 legs of the stool are present, you need a champion to keep the work and the information flowing between all 3 and keeping them working together. Now, if we look at it from a national point of view, okay, the management committee have signed off the climate action plan in saying this is what needs to happen. And it's set out in terms of policy and it's set out in terms of direction. Under the technical side, again, there's opportunity, the technology is there. And bioenergy as part of the plan, solar, but also the changing from the old carbon of the bogs and the midlands to the new carbon of the silicone and actually the carbon chips and smart information is where the technology can work. And also in terms of our homes and our ratings and all that. So the information is provided in terms of the technology and what we need to do in terms of bringing that together. On the people side, again, the culture is evolving. And we have, as I said, 600 communities and sustainable energy communities, a lot more educated groups in terms of understanding what they want as their energy efficiency in their community and taking those legs of the stool and working on it. Now there's challenges, it doesn't all work together because again, making the infrastructure work, whether renewable from the wind point of view, also involves the wires and the pylons. So if you love wind, you have to at least like wires, and it can't work without the other. We need an energy system to be able to allow that energy to flow from our home to the neighbors, to the other community, and up and down across the country in terms of making it efficient. But bringing that knowledge and making that infrastructure relevant to the community is what the education and what the communities have been about, and doing their efficiency work, but then saying, well, maybe now we could invest in a solar farm or invest in a wind turbine alongside the wind farm or as part of the wind farm that's going up as well. And we'll have a share in it. And that becomes our pension and our income from the community for the future. The other things in terms of changes people mind, obviously, is the climate and the impacts, the floods that are happening in the Midlands, and more those impacts are happening more regularly, and people are seeing, yeah, okay, we have to do something about this. It is a crisis. And as the champion, SEI, as the National Energy Authority, works across those 3 legs. But we don't just do it on our own. We work obviously through many, many stakeholders. But the system and the process that we use is used in all of our programs. And the most important one is through our communities and getting people bought into this and been relevant on it. This stage, in terms of the main energy challenge, I said it's not technology. And it has been to date generally societal acceptance of the energy infrastructure and education in terms of what it is. But the question before, well, what's in it for me? That's a developer doing this. And actually people are now, we're starting to hear a lot more. This has been replaced by, this is for our children. If we don't do it, they don't have a future. There won't be an economy. The risk, however, that I caution on is that there is so much different messaging out there now because of the climate piece that people are getting confused. What should I do? What shouldn't I do? And it's about building the trust and understanding by people that are educated and informed through the community groups, through the local authorities, through the energy agencies that are providing good, robust messaging to say, this is what you need to do. And if you do this, this is what will happen. And that's in terms of the main opportunity that we have. But there are so many different messages coming at communities and citizens and organizations that are concerned, well, where do we start? And how do we go, and who do I believe on this? But if you build up trust in the organizations that you work with, and trust in your neighbor because they've done the heat pump and they have the electric car and they have the solar, then that's where the messaging starts to get real. And that's what we have seen in terms of our case studies and through our 600 communities, that it is clear messaging that they follow the process and that they're understanding what we can do in our communities. So a community, the definition, we kept it loose. It can be any group that willing to work together to develop a sustainable energy system for the benefit of that community. Be efficient as possible, use renewables, and consider smart solutions. Very simple, and that's what we've worked through. And that definition has been at the heart of the Covenant of Mayors. It has been the heart of citizen energy communities, renewable energy communities, active energy citizens, and it has served us well in terms of working with the communities. And it's the collection of citizens working together, and it can be citizens, businesses, and organizations and local authorities that work together to do this. And the same process works for that community. And what we have seen and unlocked the benefit of the sustainable energy communities as the champion in those communities. And the organization involved is usually the Tidy Towns Committee, or it is an energy co-op, or it is a different group, or it can be a business that decides to take out the GAA clubs. All of these are now saying, yeah, okay, we'll take the message to our community. And they then can understand what they need to do. And the process that we had involved for the businesses and the best practice energy management, we simplified it, and it has become the learn, plan, and do. And that's the structured process that is embedded and behind all of our programs within SAI. But for the sustainable energy communities, that is now almost 600, are in the learn and part of the network. 100 of them already now are involved and have developed the energy master plans. And quite a number of those across all of the communities have been doing stuff in terms of upgrading their homes, upgrading their community halls, upgrading their schools, and working through that and seeing how they get on and back and working and doing more again across their plan. And their energy plan and their energy master plans are at the heart of what needs to happen right across the country. So that's the communities program. So then how do we put it into practice? And into the last part in terms of joining the dots. So giving you an example, and there's two examples I refer to, but the first one I'll go into in a little bit more detail is the Aran Islands. And it's the electric island in terms of an organization that came together as a co-op and started the thinking back in 2008. And they, working with ourselves, did a very high level back of the, fag packet as it was, obviously they're gone now, to see what is the energy that they used. So they worked out roughly 1,500 tons of oil equivalent per annum been used. 62% on heat, mainly on coal and kerosene, 25% on electricity, and 13% on transport, and roughly 8,500 or 8,400 kilometers average in terms of what they were doing. Paying out a bill of 1.2 million in an energy bill per annum for that island. So that was going off the island, going off into Saudi or wherever the energy bills were going, and not saying, well, what can we do about that? And so we have loads of renewable resources, wind, wave, and solar. So we started working with them, and we did, for example, 3-year EV trial where we had 8 cars with 30 participants. We saw a 68% reduction in energy imports versus new diesel vehicles, and 19% at the time in terms of wind energy content. That would be higher now, obviously, because we're up to 40% on average nationally, versus the 2.3% for biofuels. Now the biofuels are up to 6, almost 7%, but we're way higher now. But what they saw was real cost reduction, 78% reduction in the energy cost of running the cars. So that was on their transport side. So yeah, there's a big opportunity here if we electrify our cars. The next then was, what do we do about our homes? And 2008, taking the megawatt hours that they were using in the homes, they started upgrading the homes and doing work in terms of making them more energy efficient. And by 2013, they had reduced that energy demand by 16%. By 2015, they were getting to 24%, and the target is, when they completed, to reduce the demand by 30% by just upgrading their homes in terms of the energy efficiency upgrades. So then it worked out that by reducing the the reduction from home energy upgrades, switching to electric vehicles, and energy upgrades brought it down by at least 23%, if not more, up to 30%. Switching to electric vehicles and heat pumps would bring it down another nearly 50%. And then if they generated it locally with one megawatt turbine, they could offset all, they could use that for their energy usage and offset anything else, the last remaining bit, by exporting excess energy. And that's their journey to net zero, and that's their ambition, and that's what they're working towards. And in terms of what do they have as the secret ingredients? So they had partnerships across the community and a co-op. Collaboration with industry, they're doing work with Mitsubishi and in terms of doing work in terms of heat pump studies. Access to funding, which is through grants and other European funding. But they also had a clear vision and roadmap. Data and information that's helped with them, including working with NUIG and looking at smart networks to say, well, okay, maybe we don't have to use, or could we move our demand at different times? And that's the kind of areas that they're looking at. And a good portfolio, so it wasn't all the eggs in one basket, but a good portfolio of smart projects such as solar, the electric vehicles, the heat pumps, but doing other works as well in terms of working. And a capacity to deliver, which they have brought on board by getting extra people through European funding to help build the energy team, and showed early wins with the benefits that they have in terms of the energy efficiency upgrades. So all there in terms of that key ingredient for that community to have their plan and to work it through. So at a national level or at a local level, if it's a local authority, the same should be true in terms of the approach. And it can be true. But the question mark very often is, whose job is it in the local authority to be that champion and that facilitator? And where does it sit? And who looks after it? Is it the environment person? Is it the CARO? Everybody is busy doing their own job. So whose job is it to look after the energy piece? And that's the piece that I believe is one of the hardest to figure out. And it depends in terms of where it needs to go. So the issues that local authorities are taking this at a regional level or at a local level is there's often gaps, sometimes in data, sometimes in capacity to deliver in terms of who's going to do it. Some are lucky that they have an energy agency, others may not, but it depends on who's going to be able to do it. And very often it's the clear vision and roadmap that is usually missing, the plan. Where is the plan, our local plan, and what is it going to do? How do we do it? And it's not that difficult to believe. If you have a lot of communities that already have their mini plans, well, joining the dots on those can bring it to the county level. One good example of a local authority plan is the Portlaoise one. That was championed by the county manager. And in fairness to him, took it by the scruff and said, okay, what are we going to do? And got the energy. This is their energy master plan. This is the route. And this is what they're looking at in terms of the way to go and taking Portlaoise town as a footprint. And again, following the learn, the plan, and the do in terms of looking at their goal. One other plan I saw put up in jest at as part of the COP was, a net zero new thinking by someone who said he was going to quit drinking by 2050. Program will see him continue drinking as normal for the foreseeable future before reducing his consumption in 2049 when he turns 101. So he said it's important not to rush to switch to non-alcoholic beverages. It's not realistic. Transition to zero alcohol overnight. And to insist with transition, he's bought himself a second beer fridge, which is described as the capture and storage method. So just because there's a plan doesn't actually mean there's a lot behind it. And so be careful in terms of having credible plans. That's just a jest. So in terms of what the plans are, the community plan, the structured plan that works for communities, works for counties, towns, cities. And we see them in terms of the energy master plans and the works that are there. And local authorities are perfectly positioned to create local impact to the climate actions by bringing this structured approach to it. Scaling up building retrofit, creating livable towns and low carbon resilient places, enabling low carbon mobility, enhancing climate adaptation, making climate risk impact data more accessible, and taking distributional impacts to a just transition and tackling energy poverty. And there are so many different levers there, the town centre first, the urban regeneration programs, all aligned to this, and the energy policy fits right across the whole line. And one initiative that is there, the decarbonising zone, immediate opportunity. It's not something new, but it's applying the community thinking and the zone thinking that, you know, you can bring businesses and communities as willing advocates and partners. And most local authorities, if not all local authorities, have identified a decarbonising zone. Galway County Council been looking at Aran Islands, and again, see, this is how it can be done. It becomes the training pitch for wider action. Leverage funding, resources, and partnerships, and it allows the local authority to consider the two areas: the energy you use, but the energy you influence as well. And in terms of the tools that are available, so we have that energy management standard. We have a design standard that is there now, an Irish standard. Large industry special working groups that are looking at this in terms of industry work, national statistics, public sector monitoring and reporting, building energy rating database, all tools that we haven't had previously in terms of when plans were being developed. You have sustainability community and energy master plans that are now being facilitated through the local authorities. There's regional energy master plans that you'll hear about next, and the local renewable energy strategy training that's ongoing, as well as Energy Academy for Business. So all of those tools are there in terms of your plans and energy plans for the future. So the last slide says, in order to get it, we have a big problem, but think big. Ireland has a big opportunity. Local communities and local authorities have a big role to play. We won't solve it unless we think big and work together. However, there's big momentum already in the system. And if we get there, we have the end game of the decarbonised zone as a national objective, and obviously creating the 1.5 degrees and showing the world how to do it. So thank you. I hope you found that useful. Thanks, Donna.
Thanks very much, Declan. That was great. Very comprehensive there, national to local level tour of energy planning. So just remind everybody to, if you have any questions for Declan, to do put them into the Q&A. I also ask if people could actually stick to questions if possible in the Q&A box. It would make it easier for us to get through actual questions at the end. And yeah, we'll be taking questions for Declan after this first section this morning. So yeah, so actually I am up next, and while I'm sharing my screen, I'm going to try and introduce myself at the same time. So my name is Donna Gartland. I'm a CEO of Codema. We're the Dublin Energy Agency, and we have been working in the area of energy planning for some time now. And I suppose my background, I studied energy planning in Denmark and have been working, I suppose, with Codema to kind of develop energy planning at a local level in Dublin for the last few years. So I suppose what my presentation follows on very nicely after Declan's, and it will talk about, I suppose, some of the benefits of energy planning and what we've learned from Europe, and I suppose how that's been applied in Ireland so far. And so just a quick introduction first to Codema and who we are. So we're Dublin's energy agency, and just for anyone who doesn't know us, we're a not-for-profit social enterprise. So we're not an authority or a public body or anything like that. We were established by the Dublin local authorities to work on their behalf in this field. So we're around since 1997. And we work in the areas of research, development, and innovation, awareness, communications, engagement, and low carbon project delivery at large scale, and with the local authorities at the core of all that we do. So working very closely with them on their own buildings and their own emissions, but also how they can impact on the wider emissions in the Dublin region. And our mission is to drive the low carbon transition in the Dublin area. So I'll jump straight into the presentation. So firstly, wanted to start with, I suppose, some questions around why we consider energy planning so important. And because it's quite new to Ireland, it's kind of good to kind of help people understand, I suppose, where this comes from. So this first slide, I suppose, follows on very much from what Declan spoke about, and it's nice that we, it's good to see that, at a national and local level, we are all singing off the same hymn sheet in this area. So it's very much about bridging the gap between national policy and local implementation. So enabling that kind of multi-level governance approach to climate action and to energy emissions reductions. So you will all know, most of you know, the Climate Action Plan, the new Climate Action 2021 was recently released. And that outlines, I suppose, very high level kind of blanket policy. So if you imagine the number of EVs or the number of retrofits, there's no specific target for particular areas. It's kind of like a national level blanket policy, and it's applied nationwide. And the implementation is very much market driven for most of those policies. But each county has different supply and demand characteristics and synergies that are often overlooked. So there'll be different counties that will have the ability and, will be very feasible for onshore wind. Some counties will be very feasible for geothermal energy. Some will be feasible for district heating. Some will have a lot of biomass in industry. So there's, I suppose, each individual county and each individual area has specific energy characteristics. And a lot of the times there's local synergies that are overlooked when just, I suppose, analysing our energy system at a national level. So, and then when we get down to a kind of a community level or a very local level, the uptake very much depends on local infrastructure, local socioeconomics and community buy-in. So very much reflecting what Declan said there about, I suppose, having the community take ownership of the actions and be really a part of that. And so I suppose that's how we get from the national level right to actually where it's implemented on the ground. So I suppose energy planning supports that transition. It also helps us to create a smart energy system. So it's great that Declan actually mentions this smart, he's talking about smart systems as well. So at the moment, I suppose we're very much we kind of work a lot in silos in the different sectors. So as we talked about there, there's a need to kind of connect the national down to the local level. But we also have, I suppose, 3 different energy sectors that have national specific plans. Like the NTA will develop the national transport plans. The Airgrid have their electricity plans, and heat is kind of, there's a few different stakeholders, a few different players involved there. So there's no, I suppose, coherent energy system, smart energy system kind of plan. And I suppose that's what energy planning does, is kind of connect the dots, join the dots between national and local level, and also between these 3 energy sectors, which allows us to kind of develop a holistic smart energy system. Because what we want to do is, make the most of all of our renewable and low carbon sources. And the only way we can do that is to integrate these energy systems as much as possible. So how can we integrate more electricity, renewable electricity? How can we integrate more renewables into transport and into heat? It's only by with that kind of working together and connecting these different sectors that we can find those kind of efficiencies. And I suppose this has led to, from Codima's perspective, from a Dublin area, we've kind of developed this smart energy system vision of how this would work at the Dublin level, looking at integrating the different grids and the different systems to take advantage of, I suppose, what we have locally, what are the energy characteristics of Dublin, and the kind of grids that supports, and the waste streams that we have, and the potential for offshore wind, for example. How can we make the most of all of that locally and take pressure off the grid as well? So that's, I suppose, how we're utilizing it at the moment. And I suppose one of the key things is bridging this gap between energy planning and spatial planning. So I suppose when energy people, energy, and in the energy sector, we talk in, I suppose, a different language. And, it's the same with all different types of industries. We talk about kilowatt hours, we talk about kilotons of oil equivalent, and, it's not very translatable or usable to a lot of people in other areas, and it's about breaking down those kind of language barriers and translating energy into when we're looking to work with spatial planners, it's translating that energy into a kind of a spatial context. So spatial planning is key and really has an essential role in enabling a low carbon energy system transition. So we really need that kind of local level planning to enable us to create space for renewable energy generation. So obviously, you know, wind, large scale wind, solar, power plants, you know, energy centers for district heating, etc. They all need space. And obviously, you know, there's competition for space. Space is valuable, but, you know, we need to account for where these things are going to be located. We want and need high density developments for a low carbon energy transition. And I know that Niall later on will probably touch on this from the Office of the Planning Regulator, but there is a lot of focus on this kind of high density development. And what that means is the closer our buildings are together, so the closer our energy demands are together, and the closer, I suppose, our workplaces and our schools and our retail is to where we live, it supports network. So it supports heat and electricity infrastructure because it's obviously shorter pipes, shorter cables, and we're placing these things closer together. So it's more, those systems that infrastructure becomes more economically feasible. And it also allows low carbon transport infrastructure to become more feasible. So more walking and cycling, the closer our developments are together. So all this helps to transition us to a lower carbon energy system. We also want to make sure that our developments and our housing, our buildings, which account for a lot of our energy demand, are future-proofed, so that demand and supply is future-proofed, so that we can connect these and join these dots together, so that our houses are prepared to connect to low-carbon heat sources like heat pumps or district heating in areas where it's suitable. You know, that our buildings, our homes, our businesses need to have the infrastructure to support the 500,000 EV target in the Climate Action Plan. You know, every home should have a socket to be able to plug in an EV if we are to achieve those targets. So, and it needs to support, the spatial planning can also help us to support that kind of decentralized and community energy, again, that Declan spoke about. So, you know, we're moving away from a couple of big power plants in the middle of the country supplying us all with energy to a more distributed, decentralized energy system. So closer to where we live, we need to look at solar panels on roof spaces. We need to look at community energy investments in things like wind projects, etc., and being able to enable those and put, I suppose, the planning in place, policies in place to enable those and facilitate them. And importantly, understanding the location of future demands. So as we know, like things like very large developments that would have, large requirements for energy, new industries. Like it's very important in terms of low carbon energy systems planning to understand where they're going to be in the future and how we can integrate those and make them as low carbon as possible. So I suppose we're kind of following best practice. So all of these, we've seen the kind of the benefits of energy planning. We've seen this happen. It's commonplace across Europe. So local level energy planning is practiced in many other countries in the EU. It's often in legal requirements. So there's like legal requirements for local authorities and regional authorities in like Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Austria, for example, to actually participate and actually make plans at these at a kind of regional and local level. We'll have there's good examples from Vienna, Rotterdam, Copenhagen, and it's great to have our international speakers who will be speaking later on and who will highlight a lot of this and the practical, I suppose, applications of energy planning and what they've achieved in those cities and countries. They often have energy planning departments within local municipalities, so very, very different to our situation in Ireland. So they would have an actual energy planning department who would have responsibility for that. And the municipalities often have a much higher level of autonomy or power to act in this particular area. So in the energy area, and I suppose it's guided by, I suppose the first steps in enabling a higher level of autonomy or power is to create that kind of evidence base and increase the kind of knowledge and the the experience with the energy sector. And they often own and control local energy grids, for example. And I suppose we're kind of maybe a little bit different in this way, but there are some local authorities now in the Dublin area who are moving into ownership of heat networks, for example. And we can see how that could possibly move into, ownership of electricity, renewable electricity, and other renewable low carbon infrastructure. So that's really, I suppose, we've learned a lot from participating in European projects and learning best practice from all of these other areas in Europe. And again, I suppose Europe has had a big influence on the experience of energy planning in Ireland so far. So Declan kind of mentioned the Covenant of Mayors there briefly in his presentation. So I suppose Covenant of Mayors is a European initiative. It's funded by the European Commission. And it's about, I suppose, having towns and cities develop climate action plans or develop sustainable, well, they originally were sustainable energy action plans, but then they brought in climate as well into those action plans. And it's a commitment at that level, at that local level, to plan to be in line with EU targets and to implement those action plans on the ground. And in the process, so I think there's 21 Irish signatories to the Covenant of Mayors. I think about 12 of those have developed action plans. So there is a good bit of experience in Ireland. And when they originally kind of started out, we were looking at, I suppose, this was the kind of level, and it was a good starting point to start understanding and breaking down the energy and emissions at a local level, like at a county level, and seeing like, well, where should we be concentrating? What's the biggest emitters in our particular county and town? And it's kind of getting them to start enabling local actors to kind of realize, I suppose, what they can or what they should be kind of concentrating on in their local regions and areas. What sectors are most important. And we've kind of moved on since then. I suppose like the first iterations of these sustainable energy action plans, we would have started, Ireland would have started on that path back in 2006 or so. And we've moved on now to a much more detailed and spatially led approach to energy planning. And my colleagues who will be presenting next will kind of go into a lot more detail on that, a particular example from Dublin. So you can see how, I suppose, Europe has had a good influence on local energy planning in Ireland to date, and kind of brought us where we are now. And there are, I suppose, there's many local energy planning supports already in place in Ireland that can be used to support the low carbon transition, such as the development of local area plans and strategic development zones and sustainable energy zones, which can all integrate, I suppose, specific policy around the low carbon transition and supporting those areas, as I said there earlier, enabling kind of the space requirements, the integration of renewable energy at a local level. And these sustainable energy zones, for example, are set out under the Regional Spatial Economic Strategy for the Eastern and Midlands regional area, for example. And that's a real tool then that the local authority planners can use to kind of plan for and make specific policies in those zones. As Declan mentioned, these decarbonising zones, which are in action in the Climate Action Plan 2019, against a local authority action to develop these decarbonising zones, working with local stakeholders. Again, it's another way that we can introduce specific incentives and supports and policies in those particular areas. The climate action, obviously the local authority climate action plans as set out in the climate bill now also have to take into account climate mitigation, which will be energy, mostly energy sector emissions reductions. So that's in the bill. And we have the Sustainable Energy Communities Programme, which is obviously a great support for local energy planning, as Declan mentioned there. The local communities creating their own energy master plans and seeing what they can actually do at a community level. And then there's also going to be a lot of further future requirements coming down the line from the EU. The Fit for 55 package, for example, has new requirements for any cities and towns over a certain size to start planning for heat, for example. So there will be, I suppose, new requirements coming down the line in the next few years, and I suppose new things coming out of the Climate Action Plan 2021. So an example of, I suppose, regional policy objectives that have been introduced in the last few years that have really helped, I suppose, to develop energy planning on a local level have been requirements and objectives such as those set out in the Eastern and Midlands Regional Assemblies Regional Spatial and Economic Strategy, which luckily is turned into the acronym of EMRAS or SES. they have policy objectives in there around, say, carbon inventories for a local level. So they're measuring the impact of county development plans, which will obviously take into account a lot of energy, the emissions and the carbon from the energy sector, identifying strategic energy zones, as I mentioned. There's an RPO in there around heat mapping and identifying local heat sources and feasibility for district heating. Promoting energy efficiency in existing buildings, and facilitating the rollout of electric vehicles, making sure there's prioritization for, say, parking for EVs, or including measures for recharging facilities. So all of these things are helping, I suppose, to think about bringing, I suppose, energy from a national level down through its kind of regional level policy down to a local level implementation. So I suppose the key takeaways that I'd like you guys to take away from this are really that local energy planning is not new. It's something that's widely used across Europe, and we need to start following that best practice, that EU best practice, and kind of catching up in this particular area. And provides that evidence base for climate-proof spatial planning. It bridges the gap to on-the-ground implementation of national level policy, so we start to understand where these things can actually be achieved. It allows greater local participation, benefits, and buy-in to the low carbon transition. And it's really key for us to enable us to achieve our 2030 targets. So that is all from me. So I'm going to end I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And I will swiftly move on. Again, any questions for me or Declan, please do put them in the Q&A box. And now we're going to move on to a presentation on the Dublin, so an example of a local level energy planning, which is the Dublin Energy Master Plan. And this presentation will be from my colleagues John O'Shea and Rebecca Kachia from Codema. So I'll just introduce the guys there now. So John is Codema's energy systems analyst. So he's our heat and electricity lead. And he's worked in the areas of district energy, energy master planning, and integrated energy systems since 2013. And John has been leading the development of this Dublin Region Energy Master Plan, which is first of its kind project in Ireland. And Rebecca is Codema's energy engineer and emissions and energy efficiency lead. And she has developed local level greenhouse gas emission inventory methodologies and reports, which form the basis of the Dublin Local Authority Climate Change Action Plans, for example. And she is part of 2 European consortiums working on innovative projects in the emissions baselining and projections field. So I will pass the floor on to you guys. Thanks very much. You're muted there, John, if you're speaking.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you there.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so thanks for that, Donna. So yeah, welcome to our presentation on the Dublin Regional Energy Master Plan. So this is a project funded under the SEAI's RD&D programme for developing cost-optimal decarbonisation pathways for Dublin. So just to give a quick introduction to the master plan itself. It's first of its kind in Ireland, so building upon best international practice that Donna touched on earlier. And we're hoping that it can be used as an example for other regions in Ireland to follow. So we're looking at the cost optimal pathways for Dublin to achieve its 2030 and 2050 targets. And to do that, we're looking at a holistic integrated energy model, which looks at all the energy sectors, so the heat, the transport, and the electricity. And within that, considering the local technical constraints of adopting various technologies within each. So to do this, we've developed a digital twin of the local energy landscape, which basically acts as an evidence base for informing policy and for infrastructure planning. And I suppose it's worth noting that this is a spatially led model, which is different to a lot of other models. And it considers, the kind of topographical and spatial constraints within each individual area, which obviously impacts the viability of different technologies. And as part of this, we're also considering the wider social and economic impacts, so things like employment, health, fuel poverty, and affordability, which are obviously key considerations in any plan. So I won't go too into this because I know some people have kind of touched on this already. So where does the master plan support policy and planning at the national, regional, and local level? So At the national level, you know, it allows the greenhouse gas impact of plans to be assessed, and also outlines the contribution that that particular region can make to national level targets. So number of heat pumps to be installed, number of homes to be heated by district heating networks within the region. You know, what's the contribution of the region to the national plans. At a regional level, you know, again, it's kind of back to the regional spatial and economic strategy. So the policy objectives there around, you know, having a carbon inventory for modeling the impact of planning decisions, identifying strategic energy zones, which basically is looking at large scale energy generation, be it electricity or heat, the heat mapping stuff, you know, the district heating, you know, mapping the demands and the heat sources, and the feasibility of district heating, the promotion of energy efficiency, and facilitating the increase of EV use, so electric vehicle use. And then at a local area, it's already been used, I suppose, as an evidence base informing county development plans. So we've worked with some of the local authorities in Dublin to help develop their county development plans. It's also been used to identify decarbonising zones, which you know, are a requirement of the local authorities to identify zones which will, I guess, be pilots for decarbonisation strategies. And then, you know, acting as an online data source for sustainable energy communities in developing their own energy master plans. So having that kind of background data there that they can kind of cookie cut out an area and extract the data and use it as the basis for their own plan. So it kind of takes some of the workload off them, and then they can build on top of it with any additional, more refined local data that they might have. And then kind of looking towards the future then, and the potential of supporting decarbonisation into the future. So again, that kind of continued support for the sustainable energy community master plans. So that, again, is sharing that evidence for their development, providing that feedback loop into the climate action plan. You know, if we've got a target for, you know, 500,000 heat pumps, how realistic is that when you look at a region like Dublin? You know, what numbers can be hit within that region, and what does that tell us about the target, you know, for the wider country? And then also, you know, as a kind of a citizen and stakeholder engagement tool. So having this kind of online platform where, you know, citizens can vote for technologies in their area, or, you know, register interest for, say, retrofitting, you know, and if you get, you know, 100, 200 homes wanting to retrofit, can you group them together and aggregate them together to take advantage of economies of scale when doing that kind of work? But also, you know, providing their own data to refine the data sets, which are, you know, in some cases are kind of based around benchmarks and things like that. So improving the quality of data as we go along. And then also as a kind of a front end screening tool to provide evidence and insight into the investability of these various technologies, and how can that mobilize green investment, and, you know, kind of turn you know, what's on a map into like a real project in the real world. So I guess it's just important to say as well that one of the main motivations around how we address the master plan is that we didn't want it to be a report just gathering dust on a shelf. We wanted it to be interactive and open for use and interrogation by others. So to do that, we've kind of prioritized the use of open source tools, a lot of them Python based, which we hope will have a higher degree of replicability for, you know, other regions and other institutions. And in the diagram here, you can see the open source tools we've used are highlighted in green, the green box around them. We've also developed resources and maps that are available online, which allow for, you know, kind of, you know, say energy planners or the general public to answer energy questions in their area and increase engagement with the area in terms of local energy. So they're available through our GitHub webpage, and also via Tableau Public. And we're also trying to make some of our data available. You know, basically we've done some of the pre-processing of the data and cleaning it up, and wanting to make that available as a starting point for further research within wider organizations and academia. So we've worked with the National Residential Energy Modeling Group, and they've kind of helped us to develop this kind of standardized process for cleaning the data, which, you know, can be a jumping off point for further, more detailed research, rather than going back to the start every time you want to look at, you know, domestic building data. You don't have to do all this work up front. I suppose in the spirit of collaboration, I won't go through them all, but just to say, you know, thanks to everyone who contributed to the project over the few years. And in particular, you know, we held workshops with the 4 Dublin local authorities with their planning teams. I mentioned the Residential Energy Modelling Group, ESB, Gas Networks Ireland, the National Transport Authority. You know, they've all been really great, and, you know, we really appreciate the help they gave to this project. So yeah, I guess talking about the plan itself. So it's, as I said, it's an integrated energy system sector, so integrated energy system model. So it looks at all the sectors and how they interact with each other to achieve these kind of cost optimal solutions. So you can kind of see here, you know, that it's kind of, you know, energy efficiency in buildings, how that might impact the heat and electricity demands, how, you know, moving to electric vehicles might impact on the electricity grid, you know, all those things. So it allows us to answer questions like, you know, what areas are suitable for various technologies? What's the overall potential for, say, renewable, so say PV, roof-mounted PV, district heating, heat pumps? What areas are most in need of retrofitting? So considering things like fuel poverty and building stock quality. You know, what impact does that building fabric upgrade have on heat pump viability in general? How many more houses are suitable for heat pumps when you undertake that work? I suppose just to give an overview of the energy demand within Dublin, then I suppose, you know, the 3 biggest areas are residential, transport, and industrial, as shown here. And you know, kind of, I suppose I'll talk through the kind of energy efficiency of buildings, the heating, and the renewable electricity, and Rebecca will talk further about some of the other areas after that. So in terms of energy efficiency, we're looking at, you know, what areas do we need to retrofit first? So here we've used the deprivation index data and the BER ratings of buildings to identify the areas that should be prioritized for energy efficiency upgrades. So we've essentially taken, so the deprivation index, just in case people aren't aware, so that's kind of a metric for measuring the level of economic strain in an area. So if you have, you know, a deprivation index of, say, less than 0, and you've got a home that has, you know, a low BER of, say, D, then, you know, you're looking at areas of people where, you know, they're under financial strain, their house is inefficient, therefore they're more susceptible to fuel poverty. So in this map here, so we have this online tool where you can adjust the kind of sliders here. You can just see to the left of the map and select the different BER ratings and identify these areas that need retrofitting. Then in terms of the heat sector, so we've looked at the 2 main methods, I suppose, of decarbonising the heating sector, which is district heating and heat pumps, and answering the question which areas should be district heating, which should be heat pumps. And to do that, we've considered things on the heat pump side, you know, the heat pump cost and efficiency, you know, the cost of grid upgrades to the electricity grid. So we've used capacity maps provided by the ESB, and we've basically taken an average cost for a connection upgrade and distributed it or adjusted it across these different areas depending on how much remaining capacity there is on the grid. So if you have only very little capacity left in the grid in your area, the upgrade's going to cost you a little bit more. Whereas if you have a lot of capacity, you may not, you know, the cost will be less because there's more room on the network to provide that electricity. And then we've also looked at building fabric upgrades as well. So the heat pumps basically require a heat loss index of less than 2, which is basically a measure of pass that loses heat. And then so they're considered suitable for heat pumps. And then on the district heating side, we've looked at the network costs for the distribution and connections, the substation costs, and the heat plant costs based on averages from Dublin. And the outcome of that then is that we've identified that in this scenario, that approximately 70% of the heat demand will be served by district heating networks and 30% by heat pumps. So you can see the area with the district heating is actually quite small, considering it's 70%, but that's because the concentration of heat in those areas is higher. So yeah, just on to kind of the renewable electricity example then. So looking at utility scale PV. So to model the areas suitable for this, we look at things like grid proximity, how close this is a grid, avoiding environmentally sensitive areas, looking for open spaces with minimal shading that would block out the sun, avoiding northern slopes of greater than 10 degrees. So we've used a digital elevation model, kind of satellite model to highlight those areas, avoided flood zones, avoiding woodland, the rail and roads where dust and leaves could, reduce efficiency. And then looking at land value, so areas that have particularly low land value, like landfill sites and cutaway bogs, and then looking at sites that are large enough to accommodate a viable solar farm. So it's typically a site of 10 hectares or more, which roughly equates to about 5 megawatts. And just to note that the caveat to this is that the land character assessment layers aren't included in these. So the kind of visual impact of solar farms, although they may be low, haven't been considered in this analysis. And just to provide an overview then, I suppose, of the renewable electricity generation potential for Dublin. So offshore wind is the biggest opportunity for Dublin, possibly with some nice synergies with things like district heating. If it's connecting into Pool Bay, there could be curtailed wind that could be used to provide heating when there's low electricity demand. So to arrive at these numbers, we've looked at capacity factors, attrition rates, and strategic infrastructure success rates to basically take what's currently in planning and come up with a realistic quantity, I suppose, as it passes through the planning pipeline. We've also looked at so rooftop PV, kind of looking at the Urban Atlas data. So what sort of urban fabric, I suppose, or land characteristics are in the area, and assigning a roof area per land use type. And that's kind of been done based on kind of random sampling of 1 hectare areas around the county, taking in all these different land uses. So I guess I'll leave my section there, and I'll just hand over to Rebecca for the last few slides.
Perfect. Thank you very much, John. And good morning, everyone. Can you go to the next slide, John, please? Brilliant. Thanks. Yeah, so following on from what John was saying, so for the transport, energy use and emissions, we've made use of the National Transport Authority's Energy Regional Model, Eastern Regional Model. The NTA have developed a traffic model for all of Ireland, and it accounts for a number of different pollutants and emissions from road transport. So the model is based on traffic that's traveling along different links or roads and road networks. So rather than taking emissions from vehicles that are normally stationed in an area, the model is based on the traffic that's traveling through the area. So it really looks at the journey and the emissions that are produced on particular roads. Rail was not included in the NTA's emission outputs. It's only road transport that is included, but we have accounted for rail emissions through information that we've gathered from the public transport services. So we can see that, for example, electricity plays a major part in light and heavy rail. So this is really for the Luas and DART. And the modeled emissions produced are CO2, so carbon dioxide, NOx, particulate matter, and a number of other pollutants. So it's quite a detailed model. Next slide, please, there, John. Yeah, so we've been seeing the avoid, shift, improve, which is a key policy recommendation in the transport emission report that was produced in June 2021. So when we say avoid, we mean that we need to reduce the need for travel through integrated transport and land use planning. So the avoid principle is already being considered in government policy. So this is through the likes of, for example, compact development. Then moving on to shift. So this means shifting to more sustainable transport. So really switching journeys from carbon intensive modes to more environmentally friendly or sustainable modes. So if you see the chart on the right, we have included a hierarchy of the most sustainable transport, with walking and biking being the most sustainable mode of transport, and with internal combustion engines being the least sustainable mode. Then improving energy efficiency of transport modes. So that means reducing emissions. So looking at electrification of vehicles. And for the master plan, we've been looking at the shift and improve. And this is really aligned as well with the NTA's road transport emission projections, which we've made use of in this project. Then moving on to the social and economic benefits from the Dublin Region Energy Master Plan. So as John was saying, we've looked at this project in various different lights. So we've looked at the cost optimal solution, but we've also taken into consideration the social and economic benefits. So as a part of this, we see that there are health benefits that are associated with the reduction in energy demand and emissions. So we do see improvement in local air quality and air pollution. We see that there's local employment generated, so through both direct and indirect jobs that are created, for example, through the installation of solar PVs or heat pumps or district heating connections. There's also a reduced cost, so we see avoided carbon costs, particularly when we're talking about the cost of carbon and accounting for the shadow price of carbon and pollutants. So the shadow price of carbon is the estimated avoided cost for Ireland to remove emissions from the atmosphere. There's reduction in energy bills for residents and businesses. So through the improvement of, say, building technologies, increasing renewable energy, retrofitting our homes and businesses, these solutions all help to, for example, make our homes warmer, can reduce fuel poverty as well. And we see a reduced reliance on fuel imports, which is of great importance to Ireland, and making the best use of our indigenous resources should be a driver for the country as well. Then looking at the next steps for the master plan, we really need to think about acting at a local level or having a bottom-up approach to really have an impact on regional and national goals. So as John was explaining, the master plan that has been developed is the first of its kind. So looking at the cost optimal pathway to 2030 and 2050 targets. So looking at technical constraints, which really is the evidence base to help inform policy and spatial planning policies. But following on from this, or rather building on the master plan, is our Zero Together project. So it's a very unique project that, in a way, that it sets out to bring together and motivate a range of stakeholders. So we're looking at stakeholders in the business sector, communities, academia, public bodies, all these communities to work together towards the same goal, which is developing Dublin as a sustainable and a carbon neutral region. So a region that has moved away from fossil fuels by 2015. So then following on from Zero Together, what is needed is really the implementation of projects at scale, where we need good low carbon project delivery to bundle and deliver large scale investments that are required. So finally, some key points, some key takeaway points are that we need a joint approach to climate action. We do need the integration of energy planning and spatial planning. So we've also seen that there's the need of evidence to inform our energy policy and legislation. And as both Donna and Declan were mentioning, we need on-the-ground implementation of national level policy and really understanding how top-down policy and legislation can be implemented at a local level, at a local and regional level. And what is also evident is that we do need greater local participation in the low carbon transition. So following on from this and in the spirit of all working together, and as John mentioned, all the different collaborations on this project, we have listed a number of websites, scripts, and applications that you can visit. So we have our own website, which is still in development, with maps that are available from this project. We've links to the Energy Modelling Group in Ireland, our own building stock model that is scripted and can be used in, can be replicable in other counties as well, and our energy app. Yeah, I know we will have Q&A now, but if there are any follow-up questions that you might have, please feel free to email either John or myself, and we'd be very happy to get back to your queries.
Great, thanks guys, that was really good. Whistle-stop tour of the Dublin Energy Master Plan. I know there's a lot of detail in there, so thanks for getting through that in the time. So yeah, we've got a few questions coming in. So what I'll do is I'll just invite Declan back as well. Yeah, there's Declan now. Great stuff. And we'll just try and take as many of the questions as possible. I see, Declan, you've already been answering some of them as well, so that helps things along. So we do have a lot of questions, and I'm going to try and concentrate on the ones that I suppose relate to actual energy planning first, because this is the name of the conference. So there is a couple of questions. Maybe John and Rebecca, we'll start with you guys. So there's a couple of questions around data centers and I suppose the role of waste heat in district heating. If you wanted to kind of have a chat about that, there was like questions around like, have data centers come into the conversation on district heating, and you know, what's the kind of what kind of amount of waste heat, say from power generation and that kind of thing, is available in Dublin?
Yeah, so yeah, data centers have definitely been considered in terms of or as a waste heat source. So I think there's somewhere between 60 and 70 data centers in Dublin at the moment, with a lot more in planning. And I think from memory, the breakdown is something like 10% of the kind of waste and renewable heat we identified in Dublin is from data centers. I think it's enough to heat something like maybe 200,000 homes currently. And then power plants as well are obviously a big one at the moment, but you know, probably in the future will reduce significantly as more renewables are on the grid. But yeah, the like things like the energy from waste plant in Poolbeg, which is going to be connected to a district heating network, is one such plant. And obviously then we've got the scheme in Tallaght as well, which is using the waste heat from data centers for a district heating network there as well.
Great. So data centers,
yeah.
I suppose you say about 10%. So there, I suppose the other 90% of waste heat is from other sectors, other industries. So data centers, while useful, are only like a small percentage of the overall waste heat available in Dublin. And it's
obviously depends on where they're located as well. They can only you know, serve the areas that are near them. So
exactly.
I just come in on that as
well,
go ahead, Donna. Just in terms of and congratulate yourselves and the team in Codima in terms of the work that's been done, and I know we've been working together on it in terms of the master planning work, but you know, what people will have seen today, the visualization of, you know, the energy plan and what it can mean, and even the linking of the offshore into Poolbeg, that, you know, that there's opportunities there that then people can suddenly relate that this energy infrastructure means something to me, and actually there's a huge benefit in it. And data centers as well, to say, okay, there's an opportunity in waste heat, but there's also the opportunity on the roofs of data centers to provide the opportunity for the community solar farms to be located on and plug into their energy grid that's there. and that they become part and parcel of what the communities and the areas are planning in terms of the energy plan for the future, that there's different roles to play as well, that the data centers would be delighted to have the use of the roofs for others, so it's an opportunity to make it relevant. And I think in terms of that's the visualization opportunity, that the plans, and be it your energy master plan or what Leash have on the infographic to say this is where we need to go. It mightn't be all of the way there. There'll be tweaks and changes, and there's other opportunities to come in on it. But I think that, again, there was a question about debunking the myth of data centers taking all of our energy. Like the forecast to get up to is probably a quarter of the electricity demand. But the system grid can do it if they're planned in the right places, and with EirGrid saying yes, they'll be part of the central planning of the grid and deciding where they best to go. So then communities say, well, actually, it'd be great to have one in our area because we can use that infrastructure ourselves and actually be part of the system and work with it rather than against it, and seeing what it's done. So.
Absolutely. Yes, I think it's making the most of, I suppose, this whole energy planning area allows us to make the most of what we have on our doorsteps, and look, and
makes it relevant. It makes it totally relevant to the people that are looking at it. They can see, okay, so that's where we're going, and that's what it means in terms of our decarbonisation.
Yeah. As one other question on the master plan, on the Dublin Master Plan, guys, around the availability of the tool, and I suppose the usability for the general public, if there's any comment on that.
Yeah, so you saw there, Rebecca shared some of the links to our Codema Dev website where a lot of the online maps are stored. So within those, you can kind of pan around and zoom in and out on certain areas to glean information that way. And I think a lot of them as well, the publicly available background information can be downloaded. In terms of usability for kind of the general public, some of it's probably a bit, it was developed by engineers, so it's probably a small bit engineering still. But we'd love to kind of build upon that and make it a proper kind of slick interactive tool, where people can easily use it and provide their own personal input into the plan as well.
Yeah, so that's kind of like the version 2 of the next stage of the master plan, is to kind of make it very interactive and available. Maybe we might develop some kind of an app or something around it, and people be able to access it very easily.
I think with something like that, you have the likes of the schools programs that we work with, and the likes of TY students to say, well, okay, here are, like the hackathons that we've had before, can you create an app to make it useful to your local community? What, how would you make this data a bit more public? And there's different ways in terms of translating it into it as well, and making it again schools competition or things like that. There's really great ways that and kids that have the knowledge of technology and providing some base information to it, and say, well, okay, how would you create an app to do this? It's another way of that too.
Yeah, that's hopefully something we'll be able to develop soon off the back of the master plan. So there's a couple of questions on energy planning here that I'll just take. So there's one on what do we think the biggest threat or challenge to achieving effective local level energy planning is, and will there be development of energy planning departments within local authorities in Ireland as they're doing in Europe? Well, I think I'd like to hope so. I think a lot of this work is kind of bridging that gap, and we are doing a lot of workshops with energy planners, with spatial planners in the Dublin local authorities, for example. But I do think with the increasing, I suppose, targets and the increasing focus on climate action in all areas, that this will have to be something that the spatial planners and local authorities will have to take more will have to be more aware of, and will have to start developing in-house skills in these areas. Now, I suppose the energy agencies have been kind of filling this role for a while now, but I suppose we would like to see it being more the local authorities themselves having those skills in-house. And that's what we are trying to do with these kind of tools and with these kind of projects. But I suppose the biggest challenge is really, you know, it is kind of the internal resources in the local authorities. You know, it's kind of there, you know, they wouldn't be as effectively resourced for climate action and energy planning, let's say, than they would for their traditional kind of you know, services that they traditionally kind of provide. So we do hope that they get, I suppose, the supports in terms of funding and resources to actually develop these kind of departments internally. I think Pathfinder and that's been developed by SEAI for these kind of energy bureaus and stuff will also help in that particular area. There is a question on, I'm just trying to take, as I said, the ones that are most related to energy planning, around planning for the heat, John, or this question is probably for you. Thinking about the potential for future role of district heating, and then, you know, if people have put in heat pumps, you know, how do we kind of get over the fact that this might be a barrier then, like it might be a more strategic way of rolling out of, you know, developing kind of district heating if people already have heat pumps in place?
Yeah, so I suppose the kind of general approach taken on that is that you know, if you are installing a new system, have to install a new system, and you're in, it's basically identifying the zones where district heating is feasible, and within those zones you install something, you know, you install a system that at a further date can connect to that district heating network. So you try and make it, you know, a centralized system, you know, plant room, you know, close to the external walls, allowing kind of areas of your site for pipes to be installed at a later date, things like that. So it's all about future proofing, really. And it could being in a position to connect to a district heating network once one is developed in your area.
Yeah. So so we hope these zones, and I suppose zoning may come into effect, especially with I think the new climate action plan really outlines district heating in cities and towns as a priority. So we might see zoning coming into, you know, being a more used kind of policy tool for developing district heating.
And I suppose that's something that is already being done in other countries. You know, a lot in the continent, but then also in the UK as well. So Scotland already has a district heating zoning bill, I guess, and England are out for consultation on something similar at the moment as well. So we'll probably likely follow suit, I guess.
Great. I'm just checking the questions we probably have 1 minute left. So we've covered data centers, we've covered, Declan, is there anything from the questions that you already answered that you'd like to kind of highlight?
There's 2 points. There was a question about transport and EVs. One was about the just in terms of way we need to think about it for the future is, as somebody said, shared mobility, and not actually people maybe not owning a car, but the idea of mobility as a service. And you know, somebody asked about could you convert the existing cars? They're too heavy, and in terms of it'd be too costly to actually convert them to electric. But the choice of cars that are available now, and small city cars and little runabouts and mobilities and scooters, and planning for that in the future. And also, as I said, mobility as a service where you don't need to have a car that's parked up 95% of the time, but paying for a service that allows you to have a car when you need it, or to be picked up, or to be able to use your bikes and traffic around it. Back to your point about the heat pumps and the district heating, I think John nailed it there. It is about future proofing, and with the planning and the tools to say, well, okay, these are potential district heating zones. And there may be an opportunity in terms of the plant that goes in with a heat pump, or in terms of the energy upgrade to a system, that it's just a switch out for a heat exchanger, and then you know, a heat pump can be sold on again secondhand in terms of people using it, but also in terms of using the plant that's there. And there was another question in terms of, you know, well, what about people who can't afford a heat pump? What we've seen in other countries as well is the likes of, you know, in small estates and smaller homes or food, where there might actually be a heat pump that is running 3 or 4 homes as a system. And that's something that Dunleary Rathdown had done as well, in terms of saying, well, okay, you don't need a heat pump for one home, but actually one heat pump could run a terrace. And in terms of people just sharing the bills across it, and it's keeping the heat in it. So it's all about the planning and the idea around, you know, what do we actually need, and making sure that they're efficient as possible, and then using the right source of heat into it, rather than burdening people to say, oh, you have to get a heat pump. Actually, there's different ways about it to use that as well.
Exactly.
So,
That's great, Declan. And thanks, guys. So thanks to all of our speakers in this session. So thanks to Declan, thanks to John and Rebecca. We're going to wrap up this session now, and we'll be back then at 11:10, where we're going to kick off with our international examples and some rural example of Ireland, and with a presentation from the Office of the Planning Regulator as well. So we're looking forward to that. We'll see you all back here at 11:10. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
Donna. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Okay, everyone, we're going to kick back off now with the second half of the conference. And we are going to start with a presentation from a joint presentation from Conor McGuckin, who's from Mari in UCC, and Tom Fitzgerald, who's the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Dingle Peninsula Corcagwina 2030 project. Conor has, after completing his energy engineering degree in UCC, went on to pursue a PhD in developing participatory methods in energy systems modelling and planning. So obviously he's a very much an expert in this particular area. And he's been, for the last few years, has been a core member of the Dingle Peninsula Corcagwina 2030 and Imagining 2050 projects. And then Tom Fitzgerald, as I said, is the community engagement coordinator for the project. And Tom is helping to drive, support, and enable the local participation in the activities, which foster a more environmentally and economically sustainable future on the Dingle Peninsula. And Tom's background is in development studies, and he also has a diploma in retrofit conservation and sustainability. So we're in good hands now with these guys from on the Dingle project. So I'll pass you over to Conor now. Thanks, Conor.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Donna, and yeah, thanks to the whole team for putting the conference together. Glad to be able to share our experience of rural energy planning with everyone today. We're going to talk very briefly about our experience as part of Corcagwina 2030, which has been a collaborative effort on a number of sustainability and climate projects over the last few years. I'm assuming we have a mainly Irish audience, so you'll be quite familiar with the Tinga Peninsula, but just for the sake of it, to give a brief introduction, it's extremely popular tourist destination, which is why you've probably visited it before. So this would be kind of the main economic activity in the area. But this does bring with it some challenges in terms of critically the housing stock, with 26% of households being seasonally occupied. And in some parishes, this is as high as 40%. So you have large areas that are quite empty during the winter. And then there's also just limited opportunities for young people outside of the hospitality sector. So what we've really seen as key with this Corcagwina 2030 initiative is that we're aligning climate action with local development needs in terms of quality jobs and providing adequate housing, which is more what Tom will touch on in the second half of our presentation. What I want to focus on now is the energy planning conducted. And one of the first things we did as a group was to prepare an energy master plan through the sustainable energy community that was set up by the Dingle Peninsula Creativity and Innovation Hub. And yeah, I suppose the most useful or most important bit that comes out of this, as was already covered, is the baseline emissions inventory. So we get that initial picture of what the energy demand and associated emissions are in the area. Not too surprising with Dingle as a very rural dispersed population. The two key sectors highlighted on the pie chart on the right is the transport, private car, and residential heating, which together make up about 50% of the CO2 emissions. So just getting around and keeping people warm are kind of the main issues to target with regards to decarbonisation. However, it is important to note that this is because we're only talking about energy related emissions here, which will be the focus, but I just want to highlight that because Dingle is rural, that it's likely that the agriculture is around 50 to 60% of the actual overall greenhouse gas emissions, which does make that 2030 target really challenging when you're talking about the overall picture instead of just the energy. But yeah, as I said, I want to focus on the energy here. So just getting into how we got this estimate of the energy related CO2 emissions, a little bit touched on in some of the previous presentations. There's two ways primarily that you can go about this. What would be the preferred estimate is a bottom-up approach. So we can build a model of how many houses we have in the area and the share of the different energy ratings, and then expected values for kilowatt hour per meter squared and the average size of these homes. Or we could do the same with businesses, the total amount of businesses and size, and then use some energy benchmarks based on the type of activity. And similarly with cars and car driving, and then liters per kilometer traveled. This is definitely the preferred method because it's a bit more accurate of what's actually happening in the local area. And as John showed in his presentation, what you can do with this then is you can map this out spatially, which is really useful to highlight where your key areas of energy demand are. However, when you're working in an area like Dingle, and it's rural and it's also very small, it's quite difficult to follow this bottom up because of the access to data, which is often only available at the county or the regional level. So what you will see in a lot of plans around Ireland is a top-down proportioning in order to get the estimate, which is a little bit crude, but at least it's quite easy and quick to do to get that initial estimate. So this is based on an assumption that if you have 0.3% of the population, or if you have 0.3% of employees, then you'll have 0.3% of the energy demand. And what we did with this here was to flip it around. So instead of talking about the share of a particular sector, so the share of commercial services energy demand in the region. If we flip it around and we get the gigawatt hour per different indicators, so look at the gigawatt hour for hectares of land, look at the gigawatt hour per employee, then you can take the data set that we've developed for these different indicators and the census data, and you could very quickly get an estimate of the energy demand in each of the small areas around the country. It would be a little bit crude, of course, because it's assuming that the national average profile would be, you know, replicated everywhere, which of course, as I'm going to show you now, it is not. So in trying to improve this, then we looked at a couple of different bottom-up efforts. We had consultants that did a building survey and provided for us the meters squared by different building types, which in the Dingle Peninsula is mainly hotels and B&Bs, but then also a little bit of retail and some other areas. And then, yeah, you can apply this to energy benchmarks, like I said, the kilowatt hour per meter squared for the different business types using non-domestic BR data for Kerry, and then the UK CIBSE guide. One of the issues we found here in the service sector was that representativeness of benchmarks when you get to the different building business types, because we had very, very small B&Bs, which we were using a hotel benchmark for, that expected them to have huge hot water demand, which in a lot of cases they probably didn't. And this kind of issue, representativeness, is, you know, the same then when you get to the BR data and the residential and the transport sector, because these marks of energy efficiency, like the BER or the manufacturer stated litre per kilometre, are not actually what happens in the real world when we put people into the homes or we drive the cars on the road. However, it does at least give us that more accurate picture of the activity in the area, which is very important. Looking at then, yeah, well, I suppose why I want to highlight these issues and the different approaches that you can take. If we look here, firstly at the blue and the orange, this is our lowest estimate in each sector and our highest estimate in each sector. And you can see there's quite a large variation depending on the method you use or the choice of indicator, if you use employees or gross value added. And then secondly, if you look at the chosen value, which is our green bar, versus the very initial estimate in a population weighted in the black star, you can see that in all sectors, the final chosen value for energy demand is significantly different to the population proportioning, except in the service sector, which highlights that, like I said, that the local variation is going to be quite different to the national average. And also, I suppose it highlights the importance of having kind of a consistency in approach, because depending on the, you know, the method you use, you're going to get a very different answer. And then this makes it hard to compare across communities or across local authorities with these estimates. To finish up with some learnings here on our energy master plan process, I think this initial estimate of CO2 is really important to identify key target areas and to start seeing what it is in your area that you need to work on. However, as has been kind of repeated throughout not just my presentation, but the ones that came before as well, this data is an issue. Census data only comes out every 5 years. And then, yeah, there's stuff that's only available at the county or the regional level. And then if you do go about a bottom up and you have the data available for that, there's the issue with the benchmarks that I mentioned and how representative are they of the actual real world performance, which we could try to improve with meter data and recorded data, which I think John mentioned as well. We did look at this with a survey. So we had a competition where you could win BR assessments if you submitted your oil and your electricity bills, but it got very poor response. So it didn't really work as a means to kind of verify our estimate. So yeah, just finally there, the key thing for us, I suppose we see that these energy master plan funding could be better spent if it went into things like energy audits or feasibility studies for the communities, instead of just this initial estimate. If you could provide that initial estimate in a centralized database, that would be even just at the county level or maybe through the local authorities. Moving on then to looking at 2030 targets and, you know, projections beyond that initial estimate of CO2. One of the things that I've developed for the Dingle Peninsula is a LEAP model, which is a low emissions analysis platform. So this allows us to make projections out to 2030 based on expectations, for population growth, employees, and then, you know, growth in housing stock and cars. So it's quite important to get that picture of what happens over the next 10 years, if the next 10 years are the same as the last 10 years. You can see in the case of Dingle, the next 10 years would be pretty much the same as the last 10 years if it wasn't for the fact that the national electricity grid decarbonizes quite significantly over the period, and that COVID impact that you can see in the middle. And then as with the initial estimate, the two key sectors are private car and residential. So I want to just take a minute to focus on the pathways that we looked at in those two sectors. Firstly, looking at the residential sector, and this is the 2019 Climate Action Plan targets, because this analysis is about a year old. So that was around a 30% of the housing stock retrofitted, which in the case of Dingle is around 1,500 homes. And then the 1,200 or 1,250 of those would end up getting heat pumps as well. And if this happened kind of even spread across the housing stock, so 30% of Cs, 30% of Ds, 30% of Es, we could get a 34% reduction. But if we're a little bit more careful, if we target the lower rated homes, which would be the higher emitters, and in the case of Dingle, it's quite interesting that there's 1,500 E, F, and G rated homes. So the target could be met by getting rid of all those. Then we could get to a 40% savings. This highlights the importance, I suppose, of not just having a retrofitting target, but thinking about the type of homes that's retrofitting and maximizing your emission saving based on that. We also looked at what if it was A rated instead of B rated for the post-works improvement, but this had very marginal improvement because under all of these scenarios, we're at 70% renewable electricity in 2030. So that when you have the savings from a B to an A, it's in electricity and it's very small. And then, what was more important was the secondary heating, because at the moment, even in A and B rated homes, solid fuel is 65 to 70% of the secondary heating. So this is still a large source of emissions after you've retrofitted the F and G rated homes. In the private car travel then, we looked at just initially the biofuel obligation, which locally is seen as very effective because people don't have to do anything. They just keep filling up at the pump, but it could be criticized as kind of, just keeping us in petrol and diesel cars, which is not what's needed. So then when we looked at electrification targets, which is roughly 40% of the cars, if this was 50% of those were plug-in versus 50% fully electric, you get 20% savings. And then if those go fully electric, you get about double the savings. This is just to highlight the importance, I suppose, of fully electric versus plug-in in meeting that electric vehicle target. But then also trying to go beyond this and get closer to that 50% reduction in the new objectives. We looked at a couple of ways you could reduce the passenger kilometers and the transport demand. So what if we have 5% of passenger kilometers met by active modes, cycling and walking? And also one that Tom will touch on, which was really important, was to expand the local link route and to look at better public transport within the area. And then also work from home, which is kind of a new one, I suppose, with thanks to COVID. About 50% of people on the Dingle Peninsula leave the area for work. So if they could stay at home 2 days a week, that's quite a significant amount of commuting traffic that could potentially be reduced. But this is kind of, there's a lot in here in terms of rebound and potentially that they still have to bring the kids to school. So that needs to be worked on a little bit more. Pulling these different pathways in each sector together, what we look at here is our reference scenario for 2018 because of the recent Climate Act that said 51% relative to 2018. And then the reference for 2030, if we kind of do nothing, which is just about 3% reduction because there's some slight marginal improvements in energy intensity in different sectors. And then the climate action plan under us, I had the kind of mid-range. And then if you try to be more careful with it to get to that 37%. And then if you really throw the kitchen sink at it, if you do like absolutely everything you come up with, local anaerobic digestion, large uptake of rooftop solar PV farm. So developing a bioenergy and also a biomass resource to get rid of solid fuel, as well as having those reduced demand things in like active travel and public transport. We got to about a 46% reduction in 2030 relative to 2018, which really highlights how difficult it's going to be to do this 51% reduction. And this year is only looking at energy, where the 51% is, of course, across all greenhouse gas emissions, and it's likely that energy is going to have to do more than agriculture. To finish up then, before I hand over to Tom, I just want to talk about part of the process that we went through in developing these energy scenarios. One of the key elements was that this was highly participative. And we went out with this really extensive community engagement program, thanks to Northeast West Kerry Development. They had funding through LEADER to look at the demographic and socioeconomic challenges facing the area. And then through working with me, that was expanded to look at climate and energy issues. So we went out to people with a bit of a blank page and what are the issues facing you? And not surprisingly, it wasn't climate change that was the first thing on everyone's mind, which was a key learning for me, I suppose. When people are worried about young families settling and having quality jobs or an elderly population being looked after, they're not able to worry about climate change. That's, that's a further away thing. But then also it's really important, I suppose, to put the energy planning into this context, because you have, like John kind of pointed with the looking at energy poverty indicators, when you have 30% of the population over 65, 30% of households being single occupancy, and then 30% being EF and G rated homes, there's likely an overlap. So then these people don't have the capacity and the agency to go through the necessary home improvements. So we need very carefully planned interventions to make sure we don't leave the most vulnerable in our society behind, and that we provide warm, comfortable homes to this aging population. Last slide then for me to finish up. Home heating, transport, key areas for rural communities and rural local authorities. Like I just said there, energy planning needs to be placed in this context. We can see from a technical analysis, we need to retrofit EF and G rated homes, or we need fully electric. But it's really, we need to go out and ask people, you know, and figure out who's living in these homes and what can be done to support them. And then, yeah, finally, that I think, you know, all of this to make sure we don't leave people behind is going to require more purposeful and careful intervention like we've seen during the COVID crisis. So I'll hand over to Tom now, who is probably our greatest success to date, just to have him in existence as a project manager and community engagement coordinator for 2 years. He'll talk about some of the projects that he's been bringing forward.
Thank you very much, Connor. So if you could just move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Thanks very much, agus míle buchas de gachéine, agus de codema. My name is Tom Fitzgerald, and I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator with the Dingle Peninsula Hub. My role is part funded through a Horizon 2020 project called Plotus, and part funded through the Science Foundation Ireland Discover Award. This enables me to support closely and work closely with the community to support agriculture and energy initiatives. So the Dingle Hub was established in April 2017. Its mission is to build a creative, livable, sustainable and inclusive community, fostering a vibrant and diverse ecosystem of stakeholders to facilitate the creation and maintenance of well-paid, year-round incomes on the Dingle Peninsula. We understood that implementing this mission would require more than just the provision of shared workspace, and so we set about developing relationships, building collaborations and initiating projects under 3 thematic pillars: sustainability and adaptation, digital transformation, and the creative industries. What is emerging is that we're becoming a living lab, a place where we have built the ecosystem to enable test and trial projects, and a place where innovation can flourish. We found that unlocking opportunities through the transition to a low carbon society is a logical strategy to help realize our mission. And I'll give an overview of some of the initiatives underway. So the home energy clinic slide, Connor, thank you. We've engaged with the local community at different levels through many different projects, including the ESB Network's Dingle project and Kerry ETB Community Energy Mentor course, which is supported by SEAI. And it clearly emerged that some people were unsure where to start when undertaking energy efficiency measures in their homes. So we saw a need for signposting steps at the start of the process where homeowners could seek independent, impartial advice on the correct course of action on how to improve the energy efficiencies of their homes. Enabled by funding from Science Foundation Ireland, we delivered home energy clinics to 20 homeowners. The initial feedback has been very positive, suggesting that the intervention will enable them to progress, and we're now tracking those homeowners to determine what action will be taken. However, the challenges of accessing suitably qualified tradespeople are preventing many homeowners from making progress. When you consider that we need to retrofit nearly 1,500 homes, as Connor mentioned, on the Dingle Peninsula by 2030 to align with the Climate Action Plan, we are currently at a rate of less than 20 per annum here, then the scale of the challenge becomes very real. It is even more worrying that when we see the deep retrofitting numbers is zero for the past 10 years. We've also learned that the timelines for better energy community grants don't suit businesses in this area because we're reliant on tourism and the work generally needs to be done in the summer months. So we see the need for ongoing support once the technology is installed, and we see a role for local community energy mentors to provide this support. So the transport and travel, the introduction of the TFI Local Link Kerry bus service in late 2020, offering a 7-day per week service has proved very popular here. Initial numbers are showing significantly increased uptakes from the previous 2 days per week. The service is designed to connect with the bus air and service from Dingle to Tralee, and we're hearing anecdotal stories of tourists now able to travel from Dublin to Dunqueen and back in 1 day on public transport. This would have been unheard of previously. The service is already showing positive impacts beyond simply reducing car journeys. It's a very valuable service to enhance community well-being and reduce isolation in rural areas. We hear the example of an elderly gentleman living west of Dingle who figured he had about 2 years left of driving in him. He was going to sell his house and move to Dingle town, but the local link bus service now passing his door has changed all that. An issue that we need to try to address further is the cost of services on the main Tralee Dingle route. At present, the return journey will cost in the region of €14. Frequent use commuter incentives will need to be introduced to encourage the use of this service in preference to taking the car. Next slide, please. Connor, thank you. Local farmer and community energy mentor Denny Galvin saw an opportunity to develop a sector-based SEC and establish the West Kerry Dairy Farmers SEC. This is a community of over 100 dairy farmers currently undertaking an energy master plan to understand what measures will be required to reduce their energy consumption and generate renewable energy. They're working with startup company DC6 Technologies to develop the energy master plan, and 9 farmers have installed the energy monitoring system Watrix on their farm, giving them real-time access to their total energy use. A sectoral SEC has the advantages of common language and common measures. When this group were told, for example, that scrapers are high energy users, then a change in the frequency of their use is clearly understood and immediate energy savings on a large scale are achievable. We're seeing through this work that tractor diesel accounts for 52% of the energy use on farms, and this is estimated to cost almost 1 million annually. This is one potential market for biogas on the peninsula, which brings me on to the many opportunities for anaerobic digestion to address transition here. We commissioned XD Consulting to undertake a feasibility study on anaerobic digestion in the Dingle Peninsula. This study has been published and is available on our Dingle Peninsula 2030 website for anybody who wishes to use it or to look at it. Anaerobic digestion breaks down biodegradable material, slurry, grass, and food waste in the absence of oxygen, producing biogas. And so there are many reasons why it's a suitable solution for us here on the peninsula. To highlight a few, it can support immediate reductions in emissions through the use of slurry as a feedstock, thereby removing the need to store it. It can take offal from meat processors, which would be a key enabler here to unlock the significant local tourist market for farm to fork produce, and it can provide long-term contracts for the production of gas silage, thus supporting the long-term financial viability of farms here on the Dingle Peninsula. As the closest gas grid injection point is over 70 kilometres away, the proposed development path for anaerobic digestion on the peninsula is to produce biogas for use in local transport markets. This can include fuel for tractors and farm machinery, as well as truck, bus, and boat fleets. As the use of biomethane in transport vehicles provides the highest carbon emissions reduction of all renewable fuels, we see this as a solution with the most potential to address our needs on the peninsula, and we'll be working very hard to find the mechanisms to enable its development. I'd like to conclude with just a summary of some learnings from the journey to date. We know that moving from plan to implementation requires project management and engagement roles, which are difficult to find funding for. We're blessed here that my role has been funded in order to be engaging with the community. We believe that the sectoral SECs offer a means to expedite transition, as the example we gave. An independent energy advice service similar to MABS type model would be very useful. The community energy mentors are a valuable asset to support efficient use of technologies and the supporting that on the peninsula. And the rollout of the connected hubs is an opportunity to align development and climate goals and establish the necessary sub-county collaborative structures. So, Guramina Magav.
Thank you very much, Tom and Connor. That was great. Really interesting to see how it's been applied in a rural context, and it's great to see such success you've had so far in the Dingle Peninsula. So thank you very much, guys. And we're going to move on to a presentation from Niall Cusson, who is the Chief Executive and Planning Regulator at the Office of the Planning Regulator. So we're very happy to have Niall with us to give us this kind of national level perspective and I suppose outline the kind of role of the OPR. And And so Niall has been with the OPR since its establishment in April 2019. But prior to this, Niall was also Chief Planner at the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, and has lots of experience as well working in the planning sector in the local authority level as well. So plenty of experience to learn from. So Niall, I'll pass the floor over to you.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Donna. And Suzanne, I think, is going to advance the slides. And uplifting indeed it was to hear that story from Dingle, Connor and Tom's work. And I suppose for our area of work in the planning sphere, energy planning and climate action and so on has become a huge part of our remit. And my presentation will take you through that very, very quickly. So maybe the next slides there, Suzanne. So our body was established in April 2019. It has 3 functions in relation to assessing local authority development plans, in relation to overseeing, the delivery of planning services by the 31 local authorities and on board Planola, and in conducting research, training, public awareness, which is why I'm here today. But maybe if I could dwell on the local authority development plans that will be well familiar to most of the people in on the call. But if you're not, they set out an overall strategy for proper planning and sustainable development, and the context for determining planning applications and the assessment of particular development projects in the different local authority areas, 31 county councils, city and county councils across the country. So we're in a position now since April 2019 in reviewing the outputs from that, and particularly as the development plan review process unfolds. And we're not a planning authority ourselves. We're not a policy making body, but our job is to broadly conduct a fitness check between the plans of local authorities and the wider planning policy context, which has become more sophisticated, much broader in recent years. Now embraces climate policy as part and parcel of planning policy, the Planning and Development Act there and the graphic, and various guidelines that are issued by the Minister under a provision of the Planning Act called Section 28. And there's one important one there in terms of interim guidelines for planning authorities on their statutory plans, renewable energy and climate change. And the regional assemblies, in effect, regional assemblies of the local authorities, there are 3 of them, prepare regional spatial economic strategies. So our job is to see how the individual plans of the local authorities measure up to that broader planning policy and context outlined above. Next slide there, Suzanne. So the Planning Act I mentioned. So since 2010, there's an important section or insert into the Planning Act, Section 10(2)(n) of the Act. So that requires planning authorities, when they're preparing their development plans, to include objectives around the promotion of measures through the location, the layout, and the design of new development that reduces energy demand, reduces greenhouse gas emissions, and also adapts to the effects of climate change that's already in train. And in practice, I suppose this means lower emissions through a more sustainable approach to development, the location of development, good access to public transport, a major emphasis on increasing the deployment of renewable energy, and through local authorities analysing their share, if you like, of national renewable energy targets. We're now up to 80%, isn't it, at RESE by 2030, and deliverable in the different local authorities. And also cross-linking the development plan into wider initiatives around things like district heating, using the development plan analysis indeed to spatially analyse areas that are low-hanging fruit for the purposes of retrofitting and so on. Next slide, Suzanne, please. I mentioned the interim guidelines on climate and renewable energy. Now, wind energy guidelines might be familiar to some of the people in on the call, and there is a process underway for some time, it has to be said, in updating the wind energy guidelines. But there is also a set of guidelines that were set out in relation to how development plans should address this issue of energy planning, climate, and so on. And they're also governed by a thing called a specific planning policy requirement, an SPPR, which is an obligatory requirement of the Planning Act that local authorities would reflect specific planning policy requirements in their various different statutory planning functions. And the SPPR, out of the interim guidelines on climate and wind energy, renewable energy, I should say, states that the development plans must indicate, it's not an option, it's a requirement, how the implementation of the relevant development plan or local area plan will contribute to realising overall national targets on renewable energy and climate change mitigation, and in particular wind energy production and the potential of wind energy resources in megawatts. And factor that into obviously wider policies around amenity, residential, protecting the integrity of residential areas, and so on and so forth. And maybe as the next slide will show, this is I think something that's very much part of our work at the moment. This slide, I suppose, is intended to, refer to development plans that historically have tended to have had a lot of aspirational content in relation to climate and so on. And if you pick up most local authority development plans, very understandably, very positively, they all include this type of material. The plan strongly supports the development of renewable energy and security of supply and so on. Next slide there, Suzanne. But then when you actually go into some of the development plans, you find that there are other policies that sort of cut across that. And this is an extract from, if you know your map of Ireland, it's Westmeath, and it's effectively a mapping exercise that we have done to show, I suppose, the implications of the separation distances a development plan had included between homes and certain forms of renewable energy, which effectively mean that for most of the prevailing forms of such renewable energy development, all but tiny areas of the county really wouldn't be feasible for development for those purposes. There obviously be inconsistency with government climate policy, government planning policy, and wider county development plan objectives. Next slide there, Suzanne, please. So I think what we're trying to do, what we're trying to encourage through our training activities, we've done lots of training events for elected members. We have done research projects. Indeed, we're working with Connor and Marai in relation to, I suppose, profiling good practice in the local authority development plan process and linking up to energy planning. We want to see obviously much more proactive climate and target-centered planning that flows from the climate action plan, flows from the interim guidelines, and so on. So we're starting to see some good signs of these. The Offaly County Development Plan, the one that was recently adopted by the members, 21-27, is actually, it's very interesting to compare and contrast this plan with previous iterations of the Offaly Development Plan. There's a very good strategy in it around energy planning, and indeed, I suppose, how that links to wider concepts such as the circular economy and biodiversity and sustainable economic development. It targets quite significant quanta of energy, renewable energy delivery, and sees that in a wider context of promoting green energy zones, economic development, etc., and indeed the leveraging of amenity routes for long distance walking, cycling, etc., and recognizing the importance of protecting certain wilderness corridors, biodiversity zones, and so on. A presentation on this actually was given by Andrew Murray, the senior planner, chief planner in Offaly County Council, and it's well worth a go at this link here, maybe if you have a minute afterwards. Next slide there, Suzanne. So maybe just to wrap up, from our point of view, energy and planning for energy as part of the wider climate and sustainability piece is a very, very large and growing area of planning work and our work. I suppose historically, planners and the development plan process grappled with things like housing delivery, coordination with infrastructure, management of certain natural resources, all of those things. And I suppose, thinking about planning professionals working in a wider sense, we're now grappling with, things like megawatts and retrofit and energy zones and so on, as much as we would have grappled with, housing and coordination of infrastructure in previous iterations of development plans. So from our point of view, 5 practical areas for climate compatible planning and energy planning as well that our assessments are focusing on. It's obviously about the whole mobility piece and where we locate development vis-a-vis particularly transportation infrastructure, the availability to public transport infrastructure is a major determinant of creating a form and a pattern of development that has a lower impact in relation to demand for transport, and indeed a shift towards sustainable modes, recognizing the car and private modes of transport will be a significant part of the equation in the longer sense as well, and for certain parts of the country. The renewable energy piece I've mentioned, and indeed, I suppose the whole area of land use and how that can sequester carbon and that, and indeed how the development plan analysis can help in targeting where wider analogous measures can deliver a much more sustainable pattern of energy usage. And we've seen some great initiatives around that. Portlaoise decarbonising zone, the work of Cadema, Three Counties Energy Agency, to mention a few, and also to have an eye around the whole resilience piece, bearing in mind that there are very profound and significant changes underway as we speak in relation to climate change. They're coming down the tracks whether we like it or not, and we'll have to be able to adapt to those as well. So last slide, Suzanne. So from our point of view in the OPR, and I suppose in terms of our role in the wider planning process, there is a recognition now that planning has not the only, but a major role to play, and very much in lockstep with allied policies and programs in terms of climate, energy, and so on. There's a recognition now in the planning process that planning for renewables, the shifts in energy needs and indeed energy efficiency that we need into the future, and the networks that are required is critically important. There's been a lot of work around the legislative and the policy context that demands maybe a much more quantitative approach as opposed to maybe a more aspirational approach in the past. It would certainly help, and I know this is coming down the tracks. Climate Action Plan section 11.3.2 includes it. The translation of overall national targets for energy, renewable energy, etc., to a more regional or a county specific picture. This is needed, I think, to help the elected members to, take that strategic approach, and the quicker we can move on that, the better. And certainly we're anticipating, looking forward to that work, but nevertheless, we're taking a very proactive stance in relation to the positioning of climate and energy at the heart of the development plan process, along with other priorities like housing, urban renewal, rural regeneration, and so on. But I think as some of the recent development plans that unfortunately have fallen foul of, I suppose, the whole direction process where ourselves, the minister, effectively interact to require certain changes to a development plan that maybe breaches national policy. What those processes clearly signal is that the policy framework is there. There's very much an expectation that local authorities will move forward with vigor and purpose in relation to implementing it. But if that doesn't happen, there will be safeguards put in place to ensure that we deliver on our climate and energy obligations. Thank you.
Great, thanks for that, Niall. Really good to see the OPR's role in this area, and obviously you're kind of leading and having an oversight role in this kind of planning for climate action. So it's great, really great to have you guys in place now, and can I suppose hold local authorities to account in a lot of these areas as well, as opposed to some respect, and encourage, I should say, to encourage to make the right choices. Yeah, so that's great, and I suppose the examples you highlighted there as well are really interesting. So we might get some of those links off you as well, and we can post them. We can share them with everybody afterwards. Great, and if you do have any questions for Niall, we will be taking them after this session. So if you do, please put them in the Q&A box. Niall has lots of experience, so please do, fire lots of questions at him while we have him. So next up, we're moving on to the international experience, and we're delighted to have Judith Nair, who's senior expert at Urban Innovation Vienna. She's a political scientist by training, and Judith's been involved in the climate and energy policy making area in Austria and beyond for over 15 years. So she's lots of experience in this area, and she's been worked with as the climate and energy advisor to the Austrian Parliament for 2 legislatures before joining Urban Innovation Vienna. So we're very happy to have her to talk about her experience and the experience from Vienna. Thanks, Judith.
Many thanks, Donna, for the kind introduction, and thanks for having me. This was a super interesting morning. I learned a lot already, and I'm hoping I can contribute my 2 cents. Of course, sort of brief disclaimer: I'm one of the last speakers at this conference, so you may spot some redundancies. I'll try to skip over them as much as I can. So jumping right into it, maybe just one more word about myself. So I'm working with Urban Innovation Vienna. That's the city of Vienna's energy agency. So just for sort of easier translation, we're basically Vienna's CODIMA. And I'm going to try and just sort of give you a glimpse of how we're trying to address this problem in Vienna. Some of the things that I'm going to talk about will seem really familiar, is basically what you're trying to do, and others may be maybe using a different approach. You'll see in a minute. So to start us off, just a few words about Vienna, the city and its climate ambition. So we are just a tad smaller than Dublin, with just short of 2 million inhabitants. And similarly, growth rates that Dublin has, I think, just above 1% per year. So as in Dublin, probably keeping rents and energy prices affordable will be an issue, is an issue already. So that's something that we always have in the back of our minds. We also, because of its continental location, I think that will feel different in Ireland at the moment still, but in Vienna, average temperature is already up by 3 degrees, which is a huge problem. But to us energy planners, actually at the moment, it's hugely helpful because people are feeling the heat. Yeah, and that gives us a little more freedom and a little more sort of room for climate action maneuver, if you will. So climate action, Vienna is committed to phasing out all fossil fuels and running the city on zero emission energy by 2040, which is in line with the Austrian national target of also phasing out everything by 2040. We also have an interim target that is sort of not an absolute target, but a per capita emission target, and that is to reduce per capita emissions by 55% in 2030. And then our city target includes a specific mandate to get going on the heating and cooling sector, which will be the focus of this presentation, and I'll come to why in a minute. So we have a sort of a mandate to develop a roadmap, a mandate, but also an obligation really to develop a roadmap to show how we're going to decarbonize the heating and cooling sector by 2040. But that roadmap, the concept of how we're going to do it, is due in the fall in 2022. And you can see I'm getting nervous as I say it because that's super soon. And just one more thing about the sort of the targets and the framework, if you will, that the city of Vienna has given itself and its citizens. I think that's notable because I haven't seen it in other city targets before. The city government explicitly rules out to use green gas or to plan with the sort of alternative gaseous energy carriers, including hydrogen, for low temperature appliances. Yeah, so we're going to we're not allowed to take an easy way route that, as we see it, will not prove very feasible, but we're sort of just ruling that out to start with and then have a clean slate, basically. So a quick look just at the status quo and the development of the emission and the composition of emission sources in Vienna. And I mean, that's pretty obvious. I think it's a typical urban emission composition picture that you see. What you also see is that it's quite stable. There's just not a lot of reductions so far. You will see that we're really different from Dingle in terms of our agriculture emissions. And then just one thing I want to point out, the little bracket on the right-hand side. These are just all of the emissions that we tackle in our target as the city and also in our climate action programs. So these are the sources that we feel that the city can address with its sort of authority and with the instruments that it has at its disposal. So they basically cover all emissions except the energy supply that's covered by the ETS and commuter mobility. So we differentiate between traffic sort of from Viennese within Vienna and commuters that travel in and outside of the city. And then sort of moving from the status quo to where we want to be. So this is just a quick look at the possible emission pathways, which are in this picture in line with the reduction targets in 2030 and in 2040. So as you can see, I mean, this slide only covers the emissions that Vienna is actually going to tackle as the local authority. And you can see that, also not surprising, the big issues are really building and transportation, always the main concern. The line of sort of reduction is fixed by the interim targets. I guess in a way it's a similar sort of line as the one I'm thinking of, the example that Declan gave with the bloke who committed to be sober and stop drinking alcohol in 2050. So we're committed to stop drinking alcohol in 2040, but with the exception that we're not planning to take action only a year before the target, but taken a more linear approach to reducing. Voila. So that is really the easy part, if you will. And now I'm going to take up Eisenhower's advice, and I'm going to make the problem bigger and talk a little bit about why we feel energy planning is needed and is important and is also a hugely challenging business. So the premise is obviously, and I think you've seen and heard this in the different presentations already. So it's basically complicated. It's very, very complicated. It's very urgent, and we have to prepare. We're not ready for the transition. Is our sort of starting point, if I'm being super blunt here. So obviously, we all know that climate urgency requires more stringent and faster action, and that cities play a massive role in sort of bringing the whole sort of bringing climate instruments to scale and just moving a large part of the world's population along, really. So in terms of the sort of the urgency, Vienna focuses on heating and cooling infrastructure at the moment, which is also what I'm going to focus on. Why? Because this is the infrastructure that is most sort of notoriously sluggish. So we have super long lead times, long amortization rates, and also actual hardware that goes into the ground of cities. And with this is just the sort of clear responsibility of the local authority. So if you backcast what we want to have achieved by 2040, you realize with sort of pipeline infrastructure sort of in the ground for 70 years and production plants, if you sort of assume 50 years for that, and then heating systems 15 to 20 years, depending on the technology, you realize if you backcast all of this to today, that the problem is super urgent. So we need to start planning now. Why is it complicated? I think everybody on this conference probably knows that there's many uncertainties. While I agree that it's not a technical issue at all, I think we all know that the technical solutions to our massive problem are there. There's uncertainties with the sort of how they play together, which energy source for which use, and also what comes first, what comes next. There was a question earlier on the sort of question of, do I install a heat pump? If I know there would be a district heating grid rolled out where I live, these kinds of questions, they're really super to the point, and they slow us down. So many uncertainties, technical, social, we've heard a lot about this. I'm not going to go into more detail, process related, of course. I will speak more about that later. Obviously also there needs to be a robust governance at the local level, good quality data. We heard about this in smart data processes, as well as a high level of skills, knowledge, and planning capacity, which we frankly see lacking anywhere, really. Anywhere we've been looking, nobody has the implementation and the planning capacity for this massive job yet. So what are we going to do about this? Well, I mean, I'm just going to sort of explain to you a little bit what we tried. Obviously, we've also never planned an whole economy energy transition in an aggressively short amount of time before. So it's all trial and error for us as well. But so here are some of the things that we tried out. I'm trying to sort of connect this back to some of the questions that have been raised in terms of how do you build your governance? And I'm not familiar enough, I feel, with the Irish situation to really sort of nail it, but I'm trying to just give you a couple of pointers and then you see what you do with them. So the one thing that came up is the role of energy agencies. We are one, so yes, I would say that's important, and we're here to help. We're trying to sort of to coordinate city stakeholders for the Department of Energy Planning and for other city departments. We're trying to break the challenge down into more manageable steps. We're trying to also help and sort of gather in sort of ideas from other countries and copy approaches in other cities to help build a suitable governance framework at the different levels. And we also sort of, our role is to cooperate with and learn from other cities and try to sort of build projects, if you will, around the issues that we're trying to tackle in Vienna. And I've mentioned the energy planning department just now. This, I think, is sort of this is basically the other side, or this is the original sort of first starting point. So the Department of Energy Planning in the city of Vienna has just celebrated its 10th anniversary. It was only sort of I'm sort of lacking the word, inaugurated 10 years ago. So before then, there was no energy planning in the city of Vienna. Thank God there is energy planning now. And why can't we, as an energy agency, do this job? I think the way we sort of, obviously a lot of all of the decision making is within the mandate of the local authority. So that's the department that takes the decisions and does a massive amount of the work. And the way, I don't know if that's sort of, if that saying, if that image exists in English. In German, there's the Standbein and Spielbein. So that means like the leg that you stand on, and then the leg that kind of moves around and sort of you can play. And this is a little bit how we see the teamwork between the Department of Energy Planning and the Energy Agency. So there's the department obviously is the leg that everything stands on, and we're a bit more free to move, a bit more nimble, and a bit better connected internationally. And also we just have we add resources to the challenge, quite simply put. So yeah, and this is, I am hoping, because there was a question on how to build capacity at the local level. I forget which presentation it was, and I'm hoping this is sort of trying to give some input to that. And then there was also the question, I think Declan raised it, whose job is it to look at the energy piece in the local authority? I would say an own department's job, of course, working really closely with all of the other departments that are concerned, which basically covers all of them. And I'll come to that in a little bit. So I'm going to orientate myself, and then, yeah, just maybe a bit more of a meta idea still. So what we're trying to sort of do is to think fast and slow at the same time. Yeah. So we're trying to look at the mega trends at the global and at the EU level. A lot of them have been mentioned in presentations before. So I think maybe the one thing that I'll sort of pull out again is, because it hasn't been a point of discussion so far, we really worry about the role of green gas. So we look very closely and critically at the sort of projected availability and affordability, because we have well, if you have a gas grid in the ground, obviously there's sort of huge interest to keep the grid running and to promise that nothing needs to change because it'll all be supplied by green gas. So that is one area that I'm just going to highlight because it hasn't been touched upon so much. And then we also look at the local circumstances in our city, obviously, the existing energy infrastructure, the heat densities. We heard from the Dublin examples of how they sort of map out the data on the building stock, the heat demand, local renewable energy sources, waste heat potential. We're also looking at obviously the legal competences to orchestrate this transition of the market and of the infrastructure. And there I just want to sort of come back to one thing. I think, Donna, you raised the sort of, you mentioned in your presentation that a lot of municipalities have a sort of higher power or authority level in terms of energy planning. And that may be true for Vienna, that is actually also for cities in Austria. That is actually not true. Cities in Austria have very little or no competence on energy planning. But we are in the sort of fantastic situation that Vienna is at the same time a federal state. And federal states have authority over energy planning. And this is why Vienna gets to do a lot of stuff that other cities, also big cities, don't get to do. And I think, so I agree with you, that is a massive problem that we thankfully don't have to the same degree than other cities. Voila, and then obviously the political commitment that's been mentioned as a key driver and game changer in the transition. And again, administrative capacities. Obviously, these are all things that we're trying to sort of keep in mind and bring together to a puzzle that makes sense. I wanted to zoom in really quickly on one, I think, our most innovative instrument that we feel will play a key role in rolling out, bringing to scale really the sort of low decarbonization heating solutions, and that is the energy zoning. It's been mentioned too already, mostly in John's presentation, I think. So this is how we're trying to show fossil fuels the door, basically district by district and road or street by street. So this is an instrument that's been implemented in the 2020 building code amendment, where we included climate targets sort of as a new target in the building code. And then it was decreed that new buildings in designated areas, so not over the whole city, but in designated areas, must use highly efficient alternative systems for heating and hot water preparation. So this would be district heating or renewable energy based. Yeah, so we don't have zones, just coming back to the question, heat pump versus district heating. When you anticipate there's a grid, there's no zone in Vienna where you're only allowed to, or you sort of obliged to use one particular system, because our sort of legal advice was that's not going to hold, because you always need freedom of choice. You can rule out systems if you have a good reason to do that, but you cannot prescribe which system people need to connect to. So, so there's always the choice, but in fact, these zones are located closely around the existing district heating grid, because Vienna has parallel grids. Most of the inner city has a gas grid in the same street than a district heating grid, which makes no sense economically, but now helps us to sort of roll out, try to get more connections into the district heating system and slowly but surely make the gas grid sort of superfluous. Voila, and then there's in the building code also a complete ban on new oil heating systems for residential buildings. That doesn't apply only to new buildings, to new buildings, but to just if your oil heating sort of breaks down, you have to sort of get rid of it and you can't install a new one. Just because the sort of connection, the obligation to connect to renewable systems only applies to new buildings, I think it's important to know that 60 to 80%, we're not quite sure, it's probably closer to 80% of all of the new building activity in the city takes place in these zones. So we feel like we're almost there. So new buildings will not have sort of gas heating anymore in Vienna. There's also this also is sort of paralleled and supported by sort of the funding logic, whereby you have no funding in those zones, but generous funding elsewhere, so that you sort of also have an incentive to move in other parts of the city. So yeah, that was this is showing fossil fuels the door in new buildings, and now to the much bigger problem. Next is phasing out gas from the existing building stock. So, and with this, I just wanted to show you some of the key aspects of the heat transition mandate that was enshrined in the coalition agreement of the city government or the federal state government of Vienna from 2020. So this is my own translation. It's not, doesn't read very so elegantly, but it'll do for now. So there's the sort of, obviously the first is Vienna will become climate neutral by 2040. This is what I already mentioned. Within 2 years, we will develop a concept for the step-by-step transition from fossil fuel-based heating systems in the existing building stock by 2040 to district heating and other renewable heating systems. And this is the sort of slightly cryptically sort of formulated point on green gas and hydrogen. We actively support the development of technologies to develop green gas, including hydrogen in Vienna, which shall be utilized in, and this is the exception to the rule of sort of trying to not use it in low temperature appliances, shall be utilized in combined heat and power plants to cover peaks or other energetically highly efficient uses, but not for sort of ordinary heating and warm water preparation. So just one more, do I have a little more time? Hang on, 2 minutes. That was a while ago though. Okay, I'll be really quick. So just what I want to say, I'm not going over the technical solutions. You probably know much more about this than me, but the procedures and how we're trying to do this in Vienna. So what we did, because of this mandate to develop a roadmap, we set up, basically we sort of gathered around our utilities, all of the city departments that have a stake in this process. Our energy agency were coordinating a lot of the work and trying to sort of and build one massive local working group with subgroups that work in cross-department groups on all of these questions that have come up all morning, really. So what changes to the governance framework, how to synchronize the things that we're doing with national and EU legislative developments, how can we improve data exchange and quality of data that we need, how do we finance the transition, how do we get citizens on board? Obviously, this is going to be the key question. Voila, and we're busy working on this, and it's going really well. I think I'll say this to close, because the rest you won't need to see.
Thanks very much, Judith. We will be circulating the slides as well, so if anyone does want to, we'll be able to catch up later. But that was an excellent overview of the role of the Energy Planning Department and the Energy Agency in Vienna, and how they're working together to progress energy planning in Vienna. So that's brilliant. Thanks very much, Judith. And if you have any questions for Judith, please do put them in the question and answer box, and we'll get to them after our last but not least speaker today, who is from Aalborg University. And so Jakob Sink Tillufsen, who's an associate professor at Aalborg University, and he's specializing in energy systems analysis and energy planning. And he works there with the development of an energy scenario and energy modeling tools. And he's one of the lead developers on Energy Plan, which is great, a really useful, freely available tool that we have used before ourselves. And he is going to introduce, I suppose, how energy planning is being used in Denmark. So over to you, Jakob.
Thank you, Donna. And I will just share my screen. And thank you all for coming and also listening. For the presentation, I think Donna almost said everything. Well, yeah, my name is Jacob, and I'm an associate professor at Aalborg University in Denmark. And as said, I work normally with energy systems analysis, energy modeling, and also energy planning. And today, in my presentation, I've chosen mostly to talk about some examples from Denmark on both national and local levels in terms of planning. But if there are any questions that goes beyond what I'm saying, I'm also happy to go more into what you can do for energy systems analysis or anything if there's some questions or some queries regarding that. But else, my main presentation is on how energy planning concretely is being done right now in a Danish context with a few examples, but also how that practically actually applies to what you do in a municipality, for instance. So I think in a Danish context, somehow it always starts with heat planning and the 60s, and I think I just quickly want to start there when I do my presentation, and then else talk a little about like how we're changing the systems to smart energy system, and then a few examples on solar thermal planning, which is I think quite interesting in the sense that Denmark is not known for being a sunny country, but cold. But still, we found through planning a way to implement solar thermal as part of our district heating systems, and also the whole idea. And I think many already talked about this, our transport sector and hydrogen power to X and how to phase out gas and so on. So how are we actually doing that planning right now? If we look at a more current problem, you can say, in terms of going really long into the future, not only taking what is really maybe easier to do now already, but what is the big next step in the next 20 years or something? How is that already being considered in an energy system context? So if we look at just very fast, I don't want to go through a historical overview here, but basically the oil crisis in the 60s and 70s really what kicked off energy planning, you can say, in a Danish context, and most likely I would assume also in many other countries to some extent, that there is a need. And in a Danish context, that really for a long time really meant heat planning, you can say. Then there was a project on building out and increasing our wind turbines, but we introduced a lot of our local small-scale district heating. And I guess if you heard any Danish presentation before, also it's a lot about, well, how can we do district heating, and that's something we might be really good at. But you can say in the later years we have evolved beyond these. You can call it our Heat Supply Act, where we give planning tools to municipalities to actually zone heat supplies in their municipalities. So you're able to say, well, these areas here are supposed to be heated by district heating, these areas here by natural gas boilers. This over here is the rest, which back then meant oil boilers or maybe biomass boilers. So there was some zoning, you can say, directly built into our heating already in the 60s and 70s, and that really laid the framework for municipalities taking lead, or was giving a lead role in doing energy planning on a local level. Whereas then you can say the national energy ambitions that you made with overall CO2 targets and so on, you can say was supported by law, supported the local planning in the municipalities, and that really started, you can say, in the 60s and 70s, and carried out in how we built out renewable energy later on in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, where wind was really, you can say, planned by local authorities to a really large extent. So how has this, just quickly, you can say, changed the Danish energy consumption? You really see this. I think the active energy planning and energy policies going on in a Danish context. A few areas where you can see a big phase out of oil here in the mid, early, late 70s, and then a rather phase in of natural gas, which we are now on the verge of figuring out how to phase that out again. So there was a large phase in of gas from the North Sea here in the late 80s all the way through the 90s, and then as renewable energy became more and more efficient and more accessible, that became quite the focus of energy planning, you can say, on a national context, which for all of these cases and all these big changes you see here, actually in the end were carried out by a lot of local action, planned and governed and overseen by local authorities. So this was building out of natural gas engines and district heating systems. These were zoning of land planning of where to put wind turbines, engaging with communities. All those things really changed these things. So besides a lot of maybe national ambitions, a lot of the things going on were based on national targets and ambitions. So really that sets the offset in what we're doing, and you can say now what is the goal and ambitions you see in a current stage, and what is the offset really is you can call it a smart energy system or an integrated energy system. But this idea that we are now trying to plan a system that is 100% renewable and in 2050, or at least 100% decarbonized in 2050, and you have in a Danish context, even further, a closer goal with a 70% CO2 reduction already in 2030. You see municipalities and governments trying to improve and get to that step. So where all this heat planning and individual renewable energy planning really transformed, you can say in the Danish context, was the concept of strategic energy planning, where municipalities and regions was given both tools by the government, but also were encouraged really to make these energy plans. And I think I have to unfortunately show a few Danish words along the way, because it's mostly written in Danish, the plans that are available. But basically, they were mandated to make a strategic energy plan for their municipality or for their region, where not only focusing on heat, or not only focusing on placing of wind turbines, but really trying to get all these sectors to come together and discuss the synergies and the effects they might have on each other, and how the actors within the local region can work together, combining with what the municipality can do legislation-wise and what legislation comes on top. So what these products really are is first of all planning of where can we do renewable production in our municipality. So what areas and how does that tie into our normal local planning of land and of cities, combining that with what do we have of energy production in terms of heat, in terms of maybe a power station or so on, depending on what municipality you were in. Looking at energy savings, our building stock, our municipal owned building stock, how are we consuming energy, how are cars and so on working. So really taking this holistic approach to it, and not only having what you can say a strategic point of view, but also I think if you read them through, for some of them, they might be quite concrete on some certain political actions or activities that the municipality will do, or targets for it. So this could be, I think concretely, they can work in a Danish context on a few things. So that's quite an interesting concept, and what they concretely can do is of course set targets for their own municipal owned buildings, but also in some cities we see what you can say local lower targets for emissions in certain buildings, or you can see it for now they're looking at, can we do something with zones in our city in terms of pollution, and maybe even electric vehicles and so on. If you look a little further into the future, there's also parking regulations, things that are really concrete, you can say, in terms of promoting certain activities, whereas as these will sometimes find their offset here in these strategic energy plans, and then from there on out grow into local legislation. Another thing I think, maybe also go back to some of the previous presentations, these are really also a big mapping exercise for the municipalities. So they're mapping energy demands, energy production. So they actually through this get a good overview of what are the options or what are the consequences on a local level. So as I mentioned, really there are two predominant Danish targets right now. We have 100% decarbonized system, and we have maybe more ambition, 70 production, I don't know why it's 70% reductions in CO2 in 2030. So really coming from a situation where we are at now, and then linearly going forward to a CO2 emission totally in a Danish society of around 20 megatons, which is a 70% reduction compared to 1990. And in a study we've made here at Aalborg University, where we actually made a detailed model of the energy system in a Danish context, we can see, and we've tried to estimate what is the contribution of the energy system, and here we have to get to around 11 megatons of CO2, and really when looking at it, that means almost zero emissions from electricity and carbon, because electricity and heating, because those are the technologies we already have. This is where we are ready to do the transition, and then to be able to still allow for emissions in the industry and in transport, where we might be a little slower, especially with the heavy transport. We need to almost decarbonize in a Danish context our electricity and heat production in 2030. So I think this is really also driving a lot of the things. So if we go back to this strategic energy plan, really a lot of the things, these are examples from one in Hjørring, which is north of Aalborg, and a small municipality of around, the biggest city is around 25,000 people. But a rather rural municipality, but with a okay sized city, and ferries and district heating systems and biogas and a lot of land area that you potentially can use and all this. So really what they're doing is you can kind of see this integrated energy system as an offset and as an idea for how to combine biogas in this case with the district heating in another city called Hirtshals, with maybe combining with the heat storage and so on. So the municipalities really in a Danish context think about these system integrations. And you can see it here again, how can district heating become a clear thing? So they really try to map out how the municipality look, and then besides that also go in and look at what are the actual supply and demand in these, and then set up specific targets. So for Hjørring here, the case is that they want to phase out fossil fuel boilers. So there's a large amount of natural gas and also oil boilers, especially in the rural areas. So how to deal with that? Well, maybe an expansion of district heating in some cases, or in other cases, how to get electric heating in terms of heat pumps into the system. Electric cars is quite in focus, how to transition the public transportation in terms of buses. Is that on gas? Is that on electricity? And combining that with some concrete ambitions for it in terms of, well, 50% of certain things and 30% of cars in 2030 should be on electric vehicles and so on. So there are really some concrete targets in there. And obviously in a case like Hjørring, utilization of local resources like biogas and area for wind and offshore wind, as it's a coastal, has a large coast area, is interesting as well for them to look at. Not that they can place offshore wind, but at least they can play near shore and onshore wind. Offshore wind planning in Denmark is nationally governed. So if we look at this smart energy system, as I mentioned, it's an integrated energy system. So really the idea is that we're not only talking about electricity to heating through individual heating, but also in district heating, and also utilizing, when we do these electrofuels or methane, we allow it to be used in a context that goes to other sectors, meaning that we are using our electrofuel to do maybe in combustion engines in ships, or if we do it in jet fuel in aviation, we can use it there too. And in that whole production, there are excess heat we might be able to use in our district heating system. So this whole thinking about getting flexibility through the system is really at a forefront in a Danish context. So that's kind of the context of the system, and this example of smart energy system that really is dominating a lot of the planning, I think, is that being done right now, is how can we play into that. And I think the last part of my presentation will also show that. So if you look at solar thermal planning as a concrete example, really the Danish energy system looks a little like what here is shown to the right, and this is not necessarily the latest map, but basically we have the big plants are big central power plants, and then all the small dots are small decentralized district heating plants. So our country is really, with a 5.5 million people, really have decentralized energy systems. So if we have Hjørring municipality that I showed before, that's up here in the upper, if you go to the top of the country, and then that's a little bit to the left, that's Hjørring. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but then maybe I can show it on a PowerPoint. No, but else you can Google it and go to Google Maps and see the location, but it's in the top part of the country if you're curious. What else? The whole idea with this solar thermal planning was initiated through a lot of local action and local planning authorities and engineering companies saying, well, how can we reduce natural gas? A lot of these plants here operate on natural gas. As you can see, those are all the orange dots originally have natural gas engines or boilers delivering district heating. Saying, how can we lower this? And we cannot really, due to legislation, switch just to biomass, which is not taxed and it's extremely cheap. But we have to find other solutions. So a heat pump could be a solution, but in many cases, like, oh, maybe we can use solar thermal. So through planning with land area planning with the local municipality to get the land and voting at the local district heating grid, so the consumers get to choose and say, is this a good idea? Is it not? A lot of planning actually went into developing solar thermal energy in a country like Denmark. So really by being driven both from municipality and local plans and engineering companies, we're able to create a really, really big, I would say, build out of solar thermal plants. And now just for curiosity, I can see that Ireland has maybe a little fewer hours of sunshine than Denmark, but it's not, you can say, that crazy in a difference between them in it, if you have the infrastructure obviously ready as these district heating plants have, and you have areas where it's acceptable to put it up, because you also need some place to put all these solar thermal panels. So that was really an interesting case, and as you can see now, and I've taken from a local consultancy who does a lot of these solar thermal installations. I've done a lot of them. Really, this created from 2006 to 2017 quite a big new installment of solar thermal in a Danish context in a 10-year time, where we build out quite a lot. And it's not like this means a lot, you can say, in the overall big picture in the Danish context. But if you look at it from a small investor or a district heating company, and those, it can mean a lot potentially to their heating bill, if we can phase out gas. And I guess right now, especially with current natural gas prices, it's maybe even more interesting to look at in that context. So really a rapid expansion due to some active planning, but also, of course, due to the playing field that the national government has set up. And then my final example, and I will end my presentation, is really this whole idea now of how do we then plan for Power-to-X and hydrogen production, and maybe even combining hydrogen with carbon to make synthetic fuels and carbon capture and all those things. How is that being seen? And I can't really show a lot of concrete stuff because a lot of it is still confidential in terms of mappings, but I've seen few, and what I think again is really important to highlight is that a lot of the effort right now in the Danish planning context, and this goes into location. So again, municipalities are involving themselves with authorities, but also government, also the gas companies or the jet fuel sector or the plane operators, where to actually put these, where we can use this energy symbiosis between the different sectors. So not only are we looking at where we can produce hydrogen and we can produce fuels from that potentially, but we're also looking at, is there local district heating grid we can deliver excess heat to, or that we can take excess, or we can take heat from if we need that in the process somewhere. How is the electricity infrastructure? Is that close? Should we place these facilities offshore, onshore? Should we place them close to the the electricity production, or should we place it close to the district heating demand? And here again, there's obviously a lot of interest in this, and really from some of the bigger cities and for some of the even smaller cities, but are close to offshore wind. This is really in their mind right now of how can we involve ourselves in this. And again, if we go to Hirtshals and Hjørring, the municipality I showed before, there's really an interest in looking at, well, we are close to some good wind resources. We have biogas, which can be used as a CO2 capture source. We have ferries going to Norway from our region that we can maybe even utilize as a demand. So could we be a hub where this is interesting, and maybe then sending heating demand either to Hirtshals or all the way to Hjørring, sending some of the excess heat production. So those whole things right now, I think, is really a lot of what is going on a local level, but really ties a lot into the national strategies and the national idea about energy systems. And then there's a lot of factors to include also. Besides that, there's also storage of hydrogen fuels. So can we include our natural gas storage facilities in caverns and so on? Where are we geographically have good options for this? So this really is a planning exercise in terms of where to put it, but also how to include the people and the cities and the local authorities in a way so people are not unhappy about all these structures and so on, and actually can see a benefit from it as a local community. So finally, just to talk about it and see some of the maps we have, is that we've made kind of a map on where are the potentials if you use biogas to upgrade biogas with electrolysis hydrogen. So we've made some national analysis, and I know the gas companies have made analysis, are making analysis of where to put a hydrogen infrastructure or electrolyzers if we have to use the original or the existing gas storages and so on. So really a lot of focus on this right now, fitting into not, you can say, what we need to solve in the next 10 years, but already starting now. So we're ready to tackle the 20 years after 2030 in a Danish context. Thank you. I hope I'm okay on time.
That's great. Yeah, thanks a million for that. It's great to see the evolution, I suppose, of energy planning from a Danish context, so right back from the 1970s, and how it's, I suppose, supporting energy policy now and then into the future, as you said, like with new systems and new technologies coming down the line. So I just want to invite then all the speakers from this session to come back. So Connor, Niall, Tom, Judith, and Jakob, if you could stay on as well, and we'll take some of the questions that have come in. So Niall, just quite a few questions for yourself, and we might just take a couple of those. We might take a couple of those first. So there's one around the kind of slide you showed on Westmeath, and is there any plans of potentially reducing the separation distances required to facilitate more onshore renewable electricity from wind?
Yeah, look, I had a brief look at some of those questions as they were coming in. So what I might say around that is that I think the planning process is on a very steep learning curve around, climate, energy, etc. We have climate action plans, as you know, Donna, which the local government sector must prepare now in the context of the Climate Act. And there's a dovetailing between that and our spatial planning process. So I think that whole area will be changing, in years to come. Hopefully not that many years to come, because we don't have that much time in terms of the climate crisis. And I think it would help actually, though, because particularly bearing in mind that councillors represent their local communities. And it's all very well to say, why doesn't the local authority do this, that, or the other? I think at the citizen level, we've still a bit of work to do in connecting, I suppose, the agreement that most people would have with tackling climate with actually what that means in terms of energy planning and different patterns of development and so on the ground. And that's why I had that piece in my slide about the importance of government helping local authorities and clarifying for local authorities that, look, this is the journey, this is the roadmap in relation to achieving our climate objectives and so on. And getting those guidelines finalized or moving them from interim to actual guidelines. Yeah, that's all part of the same picture. So I think, to be honest with you, Donna, like the coming into being of our office in 2019 and the focus we've put on the climate and the planning area probably has had some positive impact in terms of accelerating progress in this area. We had that provision in terms of Section 10(2)(n) of the Act going back to 2010, and there probably wasn't a lot of detail in relation to the implementation of that up until or before the establishment of our office. But I'm convinced that, you know, if we all work together at the different levels and there is better data, you know, a lot of the issues that were flagged up in that presentation can be addressed.
That's great. Yeah, as you say, you guys are only around for the last couple of years.
2 years.
So, and yeah, 2 years. So, you know, there's been a lot of progress made since then, and obviously we'll continue on that trajectory. Interesting question just on the non-statutory plans, like the EirGrid's recent sustaining our electricity future plan. I suppose, how does that inform or influence your work and kind of planning policy more broadly?
So I suppose we do keep a very close eye on all of these initiatives. EirGrid indeed presented at one of our training events for the elected members. That's available on our website. And obviously we keep very close contact with the Department of Environment, Climate Action, and so on. So all of these, the Climate Action Plan obviously was only published, you know, in the last week or two, and EirGrid in the last few days. So I suppose we're just piecing all of that together. In fact, the question is it's very timely. We were just actually trying to set up a call actually with all the different players on that. Just to say though that we're not a policy making body. These are matters for the Department of Planning, Housing Planning, Local Government, or Housing, Local Government and Heritage as it is now, Department of Environment, Climate Action and Communications. We'll be sitting down with those departments so that we understand basically what is the ask then of us in terms of, if you like, overseeing the planning process on the ground.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks for that, Niall. A question for Judith on Vienna. I suppose, could you give an indication of what potential planning or policy levers that Vienna might use in this kind of transition for the existing buildings?
Yeah, I mean, we're in a bit of an interesting situation at the moment, which is quite comfortable, I guess, because our national government is working on the same thing. Yeah, so we're sitting here a bit sort of trying to sort of prepare in parallel, but we're not sure how much of what we're preparing as our own levers within our jurisdiction as a federal state, how much of it will we really need. We're kind of hoping that the national government will take care of some of the issues for us, and that is mostly through something that they're developing now, which is a renewable heat law, by which you basically just sort of ban the heating systems, the fossil-based heating systems, on a sort of in a method of just starting with a sort of deadline for not being allowed to sort of connect to a certain technology, like they're starting with oil. Say in 2023, you're not allowed to connect to sort of put in a new oil system anymore, and then in 2025, starting in that year, you start phasing out the oldest heating, sort of just putting a year tag to the systems, and then starting with the old ones, and then sort of phasing them out cascadingly. And then at a certain age, at a certain date, it's just like all of the rest needs to go. And the idea of this is obviously sort of to grant sort of legal security by just having lead times, obviously, but also, to be honest, to allow the sort of the engineering and the sort of industry to even sort of pull this off. Because if you say this is it, you know, it's just no way we're going to sort of lift this. So that's something that the national level works on, and we're doing something very similar in parallel, which we could implement through our building code as well. But we're not sure we're going to need it. Hopefully not. And then there's other levels, obviously. There's the sort of the whole renovation, so thermal renovation business. So that's going to sort of be mostly dealt with sort of funding, just throwing money at homeowners to renovate. But also and that is again a national level sort of piece of work at the moment, by obliging homeowners to put more money sort of to save up more money for renovation work, and for this to also include thermal renovation. So just making them sort of build up own private funds to be able to do it at a later stage. And then there's just one last thing. So for grid operators, because the other sort of question is how do we finance the fact that fewer and fewer houses are connected to the gas grid? Yeah, and the grid is financed through the number of houses that are on it, and how do you do this if you sort of fewer and fewer households are connected and left with the costs? So that is a massive issue when you talk about decommissioning the gas grid. And so that is, again, that sort of energy regulation is a national level, sort of governance level, but this is what we're sort of speaking with. This is basically sort of building up ideas and making sure that your utility knows how to formulate that problem and bring it to the correct level.
Great, thanks for that,
Yeah.
Judith. Jakob, I might come back to you. There's some questions in the Danish example, when mandating municipal areas to make these strategic energy plans that you spoke about. Does each municipal district get a specific target or something that they have to contribute to the overall national targets, or is it kind of decided at a municipal level?
So it's decided at a municipal level is often how it's done, and I would say the municipal level is quite often actually more ambitious in a sense than the Danish national level. So at least from the beginning, they can certain municipalities have options or have resources locally available that make it easier to achieve the goals faster. So I think in those cases it sometimes actually becomes quite opposite that suddenly the national government gets or the national authorities needs to keep that in mind when they do the planning and say, well, is someone suddenly moving further or faster than we are, and how do we actually deal with that? Because they might be sub-optimizing or might be using a lot of biomass resources that you might not really, you might maybe want to spread out more evenly through the country in a national perspective, but it's quite easy for rural municipality with quite few inhabitants to work with.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It's local. But to answer the short answer is that it's locally. So they set up the targets themselves, obviously knowing the global and national challenges.
Great. So it's interesting, yeah, that there's pressure from a local level up rather than a national level down in some cases, which is an interesting perspective. And I'm just going to check then. So we have, that one's answered. There's some questions on what grants or incentives are the state or local government giving households to convert from fossil fuel heating? Is there a major cost to households involved? So maybe this is, I suppose, from a Danish or a Vienna perspective.
I can say a little in a Danish context, at least. What happens is that you can say right now there's some very concrete initiatives for heat pumps in a Danish context. They allowed for investment cost of heat pumps. The national government has gives out 20% of the investment costs now for heat pumps. They will give as a subsidy if you go away from a fossil fuel based unit, so either oil or natural gas. So there's a very concrete thing. There was a lot of debate in the Danish perspective because district heating wasn't really included at the same context, which might lead to some who would have considered district heating. Now economically it's more feasible for them to choose a heat pump in an older house. So there are some pros and cons, but very concretely that's one of the national things that is being done right now in Denmark.
Great. And Judith, is there any kind of grants or incentives like that in Vienna?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in Vienna, to be honest, this is still coming together because we're not at the point where we're actually ripping out heating systems yet. It's happening, obviously, but not at the scale that we're sort of talking about now. But the national level has just put out a massive funding scheme. And I think it's actually sort of at the moment, it's sort of all about trying to not lose large parts of the population that are so scared of the costs and that have really are sort of at risk of energy poverty. So the focus now is on some of the sort of worst heating systems, and they're funded by up to 100%. Yeah, depending on if you're below a certain income threshold.
Okay, great.
it'll be funded fully.
Wow, that's great. They're great incentives in place there. That's great. Thanks, guys. I actually have a question for Conor and Tom on the Dingle project, Dingle Peninsula project. I suppose, you know, it'd be interesting, I suppose, for other communities or other areas to understand, I suppose, how you got started, where you got kind of funding from, or where you get funding from to kind of do this initiative, so that other people can maybe start on those steps.
Yeah, do you want to take that, or will I, Tom?
I'll work away, Conor. You were there in the beginning.
You can fill the gaps after I go. The Dingle is quite unique. I mean, I didn't say that, but maybe I should have said it at the start, because it kind of came about when ESB Networks decided to do the Dingle project, which is trialing electrification in the area by giving 5 homeowners free heat pump solar panels, and in case of 3 of them, also a retrofit. And then, yeah, the Dingle Hub kind of identified it as an opportunity to try to do this broader thing with the sustainable energy community. Initially, that was just funded. I mean, Deirdre, the manager of Dingle Hub, is funded through Enterprise Ireland to run the hub. She's not funded to work on any of this stuff, which has been a bit of an issue that we're kind of, in the case of her, and also in NEWKD, the community development organization that we're working with, it's almost their voluntary time that they're putting into this. They still have to do their day jobs, whereas, you know, in Marai, we have 3 full-time staff members that we're working on this research project. It's very different. Probably because of Marai's involvement as a research centre, a lot of the funding that we've gone down has been research. So we've had a couple of joint applications that went in, which is actually how Tom got funded through the Science Foundation Ireland Discover programme. There was a 1-year kind of pilot, and then that led to a larger 2-year pot, which half pays for Tom along with the EU Horizon project. And there's also now with the Creative Ireland and the Climate Action Fund, other opportunities coming down there. So yeah, the advice that we give is, of course, to collaborate with researchers, because researchers looking to work with people need, you know, groups to work with, and also then, you know, can provide access to these match funding. But it's not going to work for everybody as well. You know, I mean, I say that as a researcher, so that's kind of why we get pinholed into that. Perhaps Tom might be able to talk about some of the other opportunities.
Yeah, I think that, well, Conor covered it very well there. And, you know, I suppose we're unique down here in a way, in what we said initially in our presentation about the hub and where it came from, how it was established, and then looking at our thematic pillars, you know, sustainability and adaptation, digital transformation, and creative industry. So yeah, we are becoming a living lab, and I suppose the collaboration, as Conor put it, with the other partners in particular, when you look at the ESB networks, MRI, NEWKD, and the great spirit of volunteerism also. You know, a lot of the long hours put in by people as well in this initiative would be, you know, we've got a great spirit of volunteerism. What we also have, and you know, I'd refer people to the Dingle Peninsula 2030 website, is we have a lot of learning briefs, and they identify and look at the projects in which we are involved. For example, the likes of the anaerobic digestion, and you know, it's partnerships with the likes of the Ross na Gaeltachta, looking at Kerry County Council, the SEAI, Kerry Agribusiness, you know, the Gas Networks Ireland, and the Kerry ETV. So it's working really closely with all the groups involved. You know, we've a common objective, and that's, you know, to look at transitioning the peninsula into a low carbon society.
Great. Thanks,
if I may just
yeah.
add one point, I'd feel disappointed because I forgot to mention it. At the moment, the hub is only a remote workspace, but there is an opportunity we would see if that remit was expanded to drive kind of climate action and the likes of the tradespeople that are needed for retrofitting, because there's a plan for 400 of these hubs around the country. So it doesn't need to be a new climate office that's put into places when you already have something like the hub, if that was expanded remit. Sorry,
very good point.
Yeah, great. No, that's great. No, it's good to see, I suppose, yeah, all the different strings you guys have had to pull together to get this off the ground, and the multiple different, I suppose, funding and stakeholders and everything that's kind of come together to make the project a reality.
But also, just one final thing is, yeah, you've got the community behind you as well. You know, so that's the thing. The community is engaged, and that's the real important learning from this is that if you don't engage your community and bring them along with you, you're on a hiding to nothing.
Brilliant. That's great, Tom. Good advice there. And I'm just going to have one final question then to our international speakers while we have you at our disposal. From, I suppose, what you've heard this morning from the experience in Ireland and the kind of setup we have and the examples and I suppose where we are in our journey in kind of energy planning, is there anything very obvious or, you know, any advice that you would say that we should be looking at or anything that we should be doing or replicating from your experience that worked very well that, you know, that we could try to integrate here?
That has the potential to make us super unpopular.
That's fine. That's fine. You'll be gone off this call after this, Judith, and no one will chase after you. You're remote now.
Thanks.
It's not like a face-to-face conference.
No, but I mean, jokes aside, I mean, honestly, sort of, I'm very impressed. There's so much happening. I think with sort of there's so much activity and there's so much drive and there's a certain boldness to just go. Yeah. And I think that is the most important thing. I do think that, and I'm going to sort of try to answer this with a question that was still open about how to coordinate these processes. Yeah. Because I think this is, I mean, you cannot underestimate the amount of work that goes into coordinating and planning and all of the talking that needs to be done and the building of trust. I know this always sounds a bit new, but this is so important when you speak with sort of utilities and you're trying to sort of really do something as radical as say, this is no longer, you know, a business case. We're shutting this down together with you as partners. Yeah. So this needs so much manpower and woman power, obviously. That needs to be built up, and that doesn't happen overnight. I think that is something that I would totally focus on, like we are also trying to sort of do this. And then I also think just having, like, in that, as I said, I'm not so familiar with sort of your governance system, but I think just having partners in the authority, in the local authority, or all governance level authorities really that are in charge and really have that job to do, and then sort of have sort of not-for-profit private initiatives around it that support and that can sort of help. I think that's something that certainly helps, and always have sort of never forget to have the political commitment and keep it and have a good sort of communication line to the people that eventually need to sort of give you the freedom and the pouvoir to actually go and plan.
Great. Thanks for that, Judith. It's good advice. Jakob, anything from your side that comes across?
I think it's a good question. I think what's worked for us, and I guess can work many places, is the involvement of local authorities. And from the presentations today, I think that's really it seems like this is also happening, of course. But and then of course it helps when there's some concrete projects that can be agreed on between citizens and the authorities and so on, and try to mitigate that potential conflict that can sometimes be in these renewable energy projects. I think right now I wrote that to a few of the comments here, but in a Danish context, also to talk ourselves down a little bit, I think we regressed a little here in the last few years where in renewable, so an onshore wind turbine for a long time, when you wanted to do a project, the government put out 20% for co-ownership. So they had a private investor had to offer 20% for co-ownership with the local landowners or citizens or urban. And instead now they've said, oh, we're not really engaging you in the owning these wind turbines and using them, but instead you're compensated. This is a burden for you to have these standing close to you. So now you compensate you with X amount of money. And then people are really a lot more frustrated about going into these projects because suddenly, so don't do that. I would say if you do it, try and see if you can develop these as a co-ownership things, because it creates a lot more positive energy, I think, about these projects than just compensating people and then quiet them down like that, because it doesn't work.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jakob. Yeah, no, we've seen how that doesn't work in other countries as well, where compensation becomes like a right then, you know, and people feel that they need to, you know, that they're entitled to compensation rather than, I suppose, the buy-in is really achieved where they get some benefits back from the project from their being able to participate actively. So that's great. Yeah, great insights, guys. So thanks. I suppose we're going to wrap up today's proceedings now, just bang on 1 o'clock. Thanks so much to all of our speakers from SEAI, Declan from SEAI, from our own speakers from Codema, to Judith, Niall, Tom, Connor, Jakob. Thanks so much for taking the time here to be with us today. All our recordings and slides will be circulated in either today or tomorrow to all participants and all of our speakers as well. You'll get all the slides as well. And very much a big thank you to our organisers. As I said, this is a not sponsored conference, so a big thank you to our Codema team, the communications and engagement team for all their work on this. And it's been great to see the amount of, I suppose, interest in this conference as well, which we hope we'll be able to do on a yearly basis in the future. So great, thanks very much, guys, and we'll chat to you again soon.